Well, Sanduni, goodness, it's so lovely to see you today, all the way in Sri Lanka. Thank you for being there. We know it's early. We appreciate that very much. We've enjoyed so much speaking with you on technology, relationships, all the different topics. So that's been wonderful. You're always so insightful. So it's so kind of you to spend the time to speak to us this evening. So we were all very interested. We've been talking and different things on this idea of the fate of thought. How thinking leads us in certain directions, how thinking can get ahead of us. The difference maybe between positive thinking, negative thinking. You'll hear people say things like it will all work out. If you just think and you set your mind to it, and it will all go. And it's really an interesting topic because there seems to be truth to the idea that positive thinking is good, but I am yet to be able to think about $1 million appearing on the table, and thus it is so. It would be nice, right? So you almost have these kind of extremes with thinking, where people almost reduce they almost are like, thinking doesn't matter at all. It doesn't matter what you think; it just matters what you do. And then on the flip side, you have people who almost act as if your thinking can change the very ontological fabric of reality. The law of attraction, all these kind of things you hear about, quantum mechanics and different things. And so it seems like either of those is erroneous, but then it would also seem erroneous to suggest that just acting is the way to go. We talk sometimes, you have people who say, well, just be practical, right? Don't think about it too much. But the issue is you have to decide what constitutes practical, right? You have to think about what is practical to you. And that is already going to be an idea of what you think is practical. You think it's practical to learn how to take care of a tractor, and you don't think it's practical to learn how to relate to people or to read Plato's and different things. Well, that's your idea of practical, where maybe some people who have read Aristotle and Plato have found those thinkers extremely practical because they impact how they live their life. So it all depends on what we mean by practical. And it seems like there's a ditch on either side of the road where you get to a place where all you have to do is think, at least in my view, all you have to do is think and things will work out. But then on the flip side, thinking's always a waste of time. So it's always interesting with the fate of thought. So those were just some things that came to mind. And again, we before passing it to you or the lovely Michelle, those were just some thoughts I had. And again, it's so lovely to have you here, Miss Sanduni. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so delighted to be speaking to the infamous Garners. It's really exciting. I'm so happy to sort of, be discussing the fate of thought and how the human mind works. Because naturally, our mind is the creator and curator of all that we do and see and we think. Yeah. And I think the first thing that I thought about when I discussed this topic with Michelle was reacting versus responding. When it comes to thoughts, we have reactive thoughts and we have responsive thoughts. But do we really ever know how to differentiate between the two? Now, René Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." And I think I relate to that thought very profoundly because yes, our thoughts stimulate action, our thoughts provoke us. We are what we think, or we try and become what we think, whether it's a positive affirmation or whether it's a life goal. We try and manifest our thoughts. And I think when we talk about the fate of thought, what really, really inspired me is, yes, we could think, like your example of, finding $1 million on the table. If we could just manifest everything we think, everything that we think, we'd be in a better place. So how does thought versus what's meant to be work in this dynamic? How do we decide? So in the end of the day, why think if what's meant to happen will happen, right? Why are we wasting so much time and energy and trying to articulate such beautiful thoughts, emotions, being expressive if what's meant to happen will happen? It's almost a paradox when you think about it. And yes, our thoughts are influenced by the prejudices of society. We are constantly influenced by what we, see, what we do, where we live, who we live with. And even different phases of our life sort of changes us, whether it's having a sibling or meeting someone new or becoming a parent. We are constantly moved and changed by the environment we live in. So why do we think? Why is it so important to be a thinker if we can't control our fate? If what's meant to happen will happen? Why do we believe in the manifestation of a reality through thoughts? These are some questions that I really wanted to sort of address in this conversation. What do you think, Michelle?
Well, I think that it is true that at the end of the day, what's meant to be will be. Doesn't matter what you think or say, honestly. However, you still live your life right now. So I think there's something interesting, because though you don't know what's to come, and what you have to just sort of trust and rely on, whether you do so bitterly or not, or joyfully, is that whatever is meant to be will be. But the thing is that you still have to live today, right? You can't live in maybe 5 years time. So I think it seems to be that these thoughts, and these kinds of phrases sometimes are almost more just like a balm for your soul now, in a way. It's almost like it can help you to get you to the future that is going to be whatever it is meant to be, no matter what you think or what you do. And so I think there's something interesting about that. That's just what came to mind, Sanduni, when you were talking, because I think there is this, like Daniel was saying, ditch on either side of the road. I think that it is truly a combination of what you think and what you do, and it seems to almost be like it's more of an outlook, like, because you always have the lens, basically, you're seeing what you see today, and how you see your life and yourself and your day and what you're doing and those around you, you see that. So to kind of like, let's say you want to hook on to this phrase of whatever's meant to be will be. It's interesting even with that phrase, because even to say, is that good or bad, would depend on the person, right? In a way. And I think most people usually take it as good, because it's like, well, don't worry too much about it. It's just whatever is meant to be will be. So I think there's kind of a way in which it's supposed to, interestingly, give you almost like a hook to hang your hat on, per se, in the present. So maybe that you don't keep spinning your wheels on the thinking. Daniel and I were having a conversation about thought the other day with Inception, and there's basically a way in which your thoughts can suddenly, it's interesting, because you have to actually think in a philosophical sense to know when is thinking overthinking, right? To encourage philosophical thought is not to encourage overthinking, right? Because that's when you just spin your wheels. So the interesting thing is that it does seem like there is thought that it's very important and imperative to have the thought on thinking, the thought on thought, if you will. And so perhaps some of these phrases or wishful, either wishful thinking or these kind of positive phrases could possibly just be almost like a little, it's almost like a little philosophical outlet or something that you can plug into and just say, okay, I'll just plug that in there for the meantime, because otherwise I'll just keep thinking about it like a overthinking, paranoid, crazy person. So I'll just put it in there. So it's almost like these little packages of philosophy or something that are like tied into these phrases. And again, it doesn't at the end of the day matter so much what, it doesn't matter what you think, but it does. And that's the hard part. It's a strange place, because in a way it doesn't really matter, but in a sense it does matter for you today, because the way you think about things today will probably impact if you have a good day or not, like how you treat yourself or how you treat others, so that's really where my mind went to when hearing the things you brought up, Sanduni.
Well, I mean, you've got a few things. So first off, fate, there's fate as in you can't escape it, and then there's fate, it will catch you and you're safe. So freedom is great because you can do what you want to do, but then freedom is bad because then you're responsible for what you want to do. There's always this trade-offs. If this mug right here, I don't have the ability to force that mug to turn into a bird, or I can't, there's certain limitations, but I can. Yes, I can, right? It looks like a bird. It's got a bird on it, right? But I don't have the ability. I am free to change my thought about the cup instantly, from saying that's a good cup to that's a bad cup, back to that's a good cup. I can change my thinking quite radically, but I cannot change the material composition of that cup. So, my thinking is bound in the sense that I can't change the material composition of the cup, but my thinking is not bound in that I can change my relationship to the cup. So freedom is always, what's interesting, the difference between freedom and chaos is that there's some level of binding to freedom. There's some level of givens to freedom. Like if there was true freedom, the freest entity in the universe is, nothing, because nothing has no boundaries, it has no borders, nothing is not limited at all. So there's a line between where we'd want to, we actually do, in a sense, we actually do want some kind of bind, like fate, some kind of idea that things are going to in the future be a certain way. Like, we don't have to worry about this possibility of the future not being here. If every day you woke up you had to worry about tomorrow not coming, well, then you'd be chaotic, right? You wouldn't be able to plan for anything, right? Now that doesn't mean you can't have some economic crisis or something like that, but generally you can take the fact that tomorrow is going to come as a given. You actually could not function if you didn't. Like, you could not function if you didn't. It's kind of like Wittgenstein saying, the hinges of the door must stay put if we're to shut it. We have to treat some things as certain, even if we can't technically be certain that tomorrow is going to come. Technically, we can't be certain, but practically we have to act like we can be. So we need some grounds of givenness in order to operate. But the fact that you need some grounds of givens, which would suggest that you can't have total freedom, does not mean you can't have freedom at all. So the question becomes, to what degree are we free regarding our thinking in the future? And to what degree is it given? Is it taking care of itself? And then the next question, before I pass it on, you could ask the question of, to what degree is it given that the future that is coming will necessarily align with your thinking? So it's given that there's going to be some kind of future. It's given that you have an ability to change your relationship to that future based on your thoughts. But what is in question is to what degree you can influence what the future is going to be relative to the freedom you have to change your thoughts, because you can change your relation to the world around you. How do they influence one another?
I think that's quite interesting, Daniel, because when we talk about future and the freedom of thought, the part where I said about reacting versus responding comes into play here, because you could either react to the outcome of what the future holds or respond to it. Right. And yes, while we can't predict the future entirely, some circumstances or situations are predictable, like, studying for an exam. You can't predict the questions, but if you do cover the syllabus, you're likely to do well. Right. And that is something that you can influence. That is in your hands. Right. However, there are some circumstances where, you could have an untimely death of a loved one, or you'd have to part ways with a friend or a partner that you never thought you would have to. Mm-hmm. Or that could be a natural disaster, and you might not have had a warning. And in that moment, you really have to decide whether you're responding or reacting. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's human nature to react first. There is grief, there is empathy, there is happiness, there's joy, there's sadness. And then there is responding, where, you put your emotions aside and you take collective measures to, improve a situation or overcome a disaster, depending on what the situation is. However, the only thing that's certain in both of these situations is thought. Yeah. Our ability to think is certain. Yeah. But do we think, considering the duality of the situation, there is pain versus pleasure, existence versus non-existence? There is the reality of the situation, and there is the reality that you create in your head, especially when you part with a person or an individual, or you have a fallout with a colleague. There's two realities there. The reality of the actual situation, where both the parties are considered, and the reality you tell yourself, where you perhaps blame yourself or where you believe you're the victim. That's completely subjective. And I think it's the part where thought being so certain is what we hold on to, regardless of superstition, trends, taboos. We just constantly believe what we think. That's why we become what we think, whether it's positive or negative. Or else you would not be encouraging positive thinking. Why is it so important to be positive? Another thing that really bothers me personally as a thinker is the notion of overthinking. Yes, you could have so many thoughts, but if you're not reacting or responding to them, they could just be fleeting thoughts. So how is that wrong? How is that a condition where, your mind is going bonkers, you're just overthinking and it's rattled? It could not be that. You've just got different dimensions. But why do we always consider having a disciplined chain of thought? That's what really bothers me. And hence why I said, let's begin this conversation with freedom of thought, where your thoughts are allowed to fly. And you somehow join the dots by conversation, by agreeing to disagree, by evaluating, what is what. And obviously what's right is subjective. It could be through experience. It could be, like I said, social prejudice. You know, something that isn't true for me could be for you, Michelle or Daniel. You know, it could be from the environment you grew up in. It could be something that you saw as a child. It could be religion. It could be family values. And just because I haven't seen it or experienced it, I can't say it's not true. So how is it wrong to entertain so many different thoughts, whether positive or negative? It's completely subjective. But why is it wrong to think so much? You know, I just think that you should be able to have a chain of thoughts. It doesn't have to have an order. As long as you see it come and go, you realize the only certain factor is yourself. You're there, your thoughts come and go. Your mood is influenced by the weather, the people you're around, the experience you encountered, someone you spoke to. A lot of thoughts that I've been having lately has been stimulated by the conversations I've been having with Michelle, really. And I sometimes, you know, instantly send her a text of something I've read online, and I think to myself, you know, what would she say? You know, and I sort of have that conversation in my head, and later on, you know, due to the time difference, she does come back to me and we do agree. And it's quite profound, because if you don't express that random thought, you'd never know that someone could resonate with it. And there's nothing wrong with that if they don't. There's nothing absolutely wrong with not resonating with a thought. But it's okay to think about the clouds and then think about Kant's prerogative theory. You know, it's completely fine. You could have entirely two different notions, or talk about how bizarre the Republic is. That's completely fine, as long as you're able to think it through in an orderly manner. Or perhaps not. You could have muddled thoughts that you express, and somehow end of this conversation it could make sense.
I love the framing that you're doing there on you know, that you're responding. What was it with the two R words there, Sanduni?
Reacting versus responding.
Reacting and responding. I think that's a very profound question, because I think it gets mixed up to the question of to what degree, like I was saying, to repeat it, like with this cup, I am not free to turn this cup into a bird, right? You know, freedom and matter are always kind of structured together, right? So to some degree, I must respond to the cup. You know, I must just kind of, or we could say I must react to the cup and being there and spilling coffee on me. And then also I can respond to my thoughts about the cup, right? So that freedom, yeah, I think it really messes up a lot of the discussions about freedom when we think it's kind of either or. You know, freedom is always dressed in causation and causality. You know, if not, like, you know, if I have a river, and it's going down a riverbed and it comes to a turn and it turns in the riverbed, you know, relative to if you were in the river, it would seem like it was just going straight, right? You know, if it was gradual enough, and it would seem like it was all the same, but the direction of the river has changed. So likewise, a lot of times freedom changes the direction of causality. So the entire role of freedom is dressed in causality, which makes it seem like that freedom's not there at all, that it's just cause and effect the entire time. In the same way that when you speak words to someone, like the moment I say, how are you doing? You know, you're no longer free to exist in a world where someone doesn't say, how are you doing? And so, you know, it actually, in that act, it feels like I've proven that you don't have free will, because now you have to respond. But actually that very freedom, that very feeling that you don't have a choice but to think those thoughts, actually proves that you had something a second ago that's not there anymore. And the thing that you must have had a second ago is freedom, and now it's gone. The funny thing is we tend to note freedom in the acts when it is taken, but when it's not taken, since it's behind a veil of causality, then we don't notice it. We only notice it when it's gone. So our impression is that we do not have it. And so we get out of balance. And really a lot of the role of thinking is in regard to the regard of freedom is in regard to thinking, because thinking is how I can control my relation to materiality. But the issue is that the way that thinking frees us from materiality tends to be gradual. I cannot transform this cup into a bird all at once, but I can by thinking about this cup, thinking how I want a bird, then go to the car, get in the car, drive to the animal shop and buy a bird. And now I have a bird. So the thought of the cup wanting a bird can set into course a reality that brings about what I'm thinking about. But I just can't instantly get it. And the fact that you can't instantly get it, that it has to operate according to space-time, can create the impression that you don't have freedom. When really freedom often is sort of directed and in regard to its freedom is always manifest dressed in causation. Freedom is always manifest dressed in causation and thus seemingly determined, which can create the impression that we're not free at all. So, you know, just a point as I buy time for Reed to fall asleep. So, freedom is always dressed in causation.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to be mindful about what you're thinking, because, there's this very common phrase that we use at times of, a random act that surprises you, where you say, what were you thinking? Or were you thinking at all? So the irony where the human mind wanders so much from every second to every minute, yet our actions sometimes don't make sense. You constantly ask yourself, what was I thinking? Or what were you thinking? What triggered you to do that? So what I've been really trying to understand is the thin line between being mindful and being thoughtful and being a thinker.
Yes.
Those three things are very important, but they don't come together. That's the problem. You could be thinking, but you could not be awake. And if you're not awake and in sync with your thoughts, it's just words that you're rumbling in your head. The only difference is that you're not thinking out loud. Sometimes we do think out loud. We just say something and we wonder, hang on a minute, that doesn't really sit right with me. So why did I say what I said? Right. And that's where common sense comes into play as well. When you think something, you're just so caught up in manifesting that into an immediate reality that you forget to be aware and awake, and you forget to sort of realize, will this thought be a lasting one? Usually when I try to make a decision, I tell myself, I'm going to sleep on it and wake up tomorrow or the day after and then decide, I have a clearer picture of what I'm trying to do. Even with a piece of writing, I would write something and then wake up the next day and think, all right, that's not what I was trying to say. Let's rephrase that. So we don't tend to do that with our thoughts because it's so fleeting, right? It's not tangible. You can't hold on to it like a piece of paper or a conversation that you're supposed to be recording. Thoughts are fleeting and they're almost abstract till you eventually manifest them into a reality.
That's right.
And that's where you sort of have very indisciplined thoughts. They run around, but if you don't pace it right in your mind, it could just lead to an outcome that does not resonate. And then we convince ourselves saying, if it's meant to be, it will be.
Yeah, that's right.
So usually we blame fate when it's about something that's gone wrong. That's how we placate ourselves or give ourselves solace or console ourselves, saying, all right, it didn't work out. It just wasn't meant to be. But perhaps the way you reacted changed the outcome of your fate. Were you responding or reacting? Were you triggered or stimulated? I've been contemplating these notions for quite some time, hence why I thought we should talk about it. Because we don't really know the difference, do we, Daniel? We could be the most profound thinker, but we can't really tell if we're reacting or responding. I can't most of the times. So I do take a step back. And even when I engage in conversation, I sort of think, am I saying this because I'm stimulated by what we're discussing? Or am I stimulated by my past experiences or the situation or the state of mind I'm in today? And it does have an impact indirectly or directly. We can't help it. We're human. And it's part and parcel of being a thinker. You just sort of have to let it happen.
Oh, yeah.
How's Michelle doing?
Well, this is going to be the night where Reed doesn't fall back asleep. So, it'll be hilarious. But, see, like I said, everything you're saying so wonderful. I may not cut it. But when she comes back to respond. Well, what you're getting at is, the reason I'm talking, I bring up the fact that freedom is always in response to causation is precisely because if we never, ever were reacting to anything, we would have no material for response. You see, freedom needs causation in order to have a material by which to direct. And so likewise, if we were never reacting, we would have nothing to respond to. So that's where it gets very tricky, because response is precisely possible because we're always reacting. Like if there was no such thing as reaction, there would be nothing we could respond to because there would be no space-time. There'd be no cause and effect. Likewise, if there was no causation, which makes it seem like we don't have freedom, we wouldn't have anything we could direct with freedom. And so that's why it always gets kind of tricky, is because the very thing that we use our freedom to direct makes it seem like we don't have freedom. Likewise, the very thing that makes response possible is that which makes it seem like we're never responding. So that's why you always get an existential tension, right? Because that's why it's like, well, we're not free. We're just cogs in a machine, right? Because the freedom is what is turning the cogs in the machine, but it always appears as a cog and therefore makes it seem like we're not there. So I think on this question of how can you tell when you're just reacting versus responding? Well, one, the very act of asking that question is not something that you are ever forced to do by causation. Causation will never force you to ask, was this causation or not? So the moment you slip into the question, was this response or was this reaction, you are actually carrying out a responsive act. By definition, it has to be a responsive act because you are looking at it. You know, materiality, another way to look at it, cause and effect is always horizontal. It's always moving horizontally. So the moment you look at it vertically, you're doing something that is not part of the horizontal dimension, right? You're doing something that cannot be reduced to mere reaction, even if it would not be possible without reaction. So I think one of the things, because you also get into the question on like what constitutes reaction, I think you have to, so you get into a lot of things like, for example, these differences between overthinking, you know, you're talking about thinking, mindful, and so on and so forth. I think a critical point that we were talking about with the inception talk is actually if you don't think deeply, that's when you overthink. Overthinking is actually a result of not deep thinking. Because in today's world, you know, James Joyce referred to the world today as a thought-tormented age. You know, you can't help but think. And sociologically, there's been the loss of givens, you know, so we don't know what to think. You know, it used to be you would be born in Virginia, everyone around you would be Baptist, you know, it would just be given that that's what you're supposed to do, right? Well, that's no longer the case. There's been an explosion of options and possibilities, and things are not given anymore. And so now you're free. You know, you're not forced to be bound by these principles you never think about and just accept as true. But with that freedom comes a feeling that it's all arbitrary and confusing, right? You know, you don't know what to do. So what ends up happening is we're always thinking what to believe, what to do, what we can do in our life. You know, in a world where you're not forced to be a blacksmith because your dad was a blacksmith, you can be whatever you want. So what should you be? And how do you decide? And by what standard? And then you go crazy. So, you know, it's a thought-tormented age. Well, here's the thing. If it's a thought-tormented age, then there's two choices, deep thinking or overthinking. And the question is, what are you going to do? You want to deep think or you want to overthink? And I think the term overthink is very bad language. One almost wants to say circular thought or kind of like circular. What I mean by that is kind of like the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland, where you're running around the tree. You're running a lot, but you're not going anywhere. You could even make the difference between progressive thought and unprogressive thought, but you almost can't do that because it's so politically hefty now. But it seems like what you're saying is the difference between disciplined thought and non-disciplined thought. You know, there's a radical difference. And what ends up happening is overthinking is a consequence of not thinking with discipline, within a structure, you know, toward a certain goal, and you don't know what to think about. And deep thinking is precisely, it's really actually quite terrible, because what we've done today is we've conflated overthinking with deep thinking. Therefore, nobody deep thinks, so therefore everyone overthinks. And then they think that the solution to the problem is something that would make it worse, when in fact it would make it better. And so then nobody knows what to do anymore. They're all quite confused. So you have to have that disciplined thinking. Similarly, so likewise, in a way, when we're talking about like where people, are you an optimist or you a pessimist, which I think can tie to the fate conversation. You know, the problem is you really want to be a realist, right? You know, you don't really want to be an optimist or a pessimist. You want to be a realist. You want to see clearly, so that you can figure out what to do and to what to think. So likewise, when it comes to the question of identifying when one is responding or when they are reacting, the first thing you have to do is like see the situation really, really clearly. And you have to see really clearly what is influencing you, right? You know, is it like, okay, well, I'm thinking this because, you know, this person did something to me that was really nice, so I give them the benefit of the doubt. So I myself struggle to imagine that they would ever lie to me. So therefore, I might be overlooking the evidence that would suggest they did something wrong. Or maybe it's the reverse. Maybe they one time did something bad, so you're angry at them. So then you, even when they say something that's true, you just assume it's manipulation because of the thing that happened in the past. So one, you examine what are all the emotional elements that are coming into play. What's really so lovely about your question is you're actually asking, like, what is the repertoire, the toolbox of mental models that a person needs that they bring into a situation and fling through, like wrenches, hammers, different mental models, in order to get, here's the thing, confidence that they are responding and not just reacting, because you can't get certainty. No one can get certainty. Certainty is impossible, just about. But you can get, but you can't get confidence that you're not just reacting. You can't get confidence that you're responding. So first off, you would need what I call emotional intelligence, to not just emotionalism, but emotional intelligence, to intelligently weigh what degree your thinking about X event is influenced by emotions. Critically, the fact that it has influenced emotions may actually be why you're more accurate, not less. You see, there's an assumption that emotion makes you stupider. Well, that's not true. Emotion could actually make you smarter. You can't make that assumption, right? It depends on the nature of the emotion. So you have to analyze it. So you have your emotional intelligence. The other thing is you have to ask yourself, when you think of a situation, are you only thinking of the negatives? Are you only thinking of the positives? Are you only thinking about what you remember? Are you taking other people's point of view into account? And I can go on and on. We'll continue this conversation. But one of the things to highlight before I hand it back is that in order to figure out if you are responding as opposed to merely reacting, because you always must be to some degree both, okay? Like we're saying, every freedom is always dressed in causation. It's always both. The question then is not if you're just responding or just reacting, but that you're more responding than reacting, right? Say you're 80% reacting and only 20%, you're 80% responding and 20% reacting, or, 70% responding and 30% reacting. So that should be the goal. The question, I guess the first question becomes, what is the metric? What do we consider the metric of success, right? Well, the metric, I would say the metric should be that the majority of what we're doing is responding and not reacting, right? We never just want to be reacting, where we don't have control. Because what is it, when I hear that language, to me, it suggests a lack of control. You don't have control. Now, critically, when I say that, even that one has to be careful, because there's actually times where you should choose to go with the flow, where you shouldn't want control. But I would actually argue there you actually, even in that situation, in a sense, have control of yourself, because you are controlling yourself to go with the flow. So when I'm talking about control in this situation, I'm mostly talking about self-control, not controlling external situations. So, when you say respond, that makes me think of self-control. And we always want to be mostly in control of ourselves, right? As opposed to just being pushed along by our minds, which we haven't disciplined, or our emotions that we haven't disciplined, and that should be the goal. Does that make sense? Is that kind of in the ballpark? Does that make sense of what we're saying? What I'm saying?
Yes, absolutely, it does. And I think the point about structure, about being born in Virginia and everyone being baptized, that example can mean many things, Daniel, because yes, we live in a world that's unbecoming what it has been. If you think about it, we are evolving, but we're unbecoming in terms of literature, in terms of philosophy, in terms of religion, in terms of tradition. Those things are unbecoming. They're not becoming, they are unbecoming.
Sure.
Now you don't really need to have traditions or a specific religion or a structure or a political value. You could always be the one in between. And yes, it also has negative connotations when you think about Kant's categorical imperative. He was a traditionalist who believed in structure and all of that. And now you have philosophers that challenge those views. Yes, part of philosophy is challenging views in modern times and vice versa. But having said that, a lot of that deconstruction is reflected in the human mind. Yes, we do question the reality we live in more than we ever did before. We're less accepting. But sometimes between being less accepting and deconstructing, we sort of lose our place in the sense of where we identify ourselves. You can't not have a stance on a situation. You need to have some sort of perspective. If you are neutral, what makes you neutral? If you don't, there is some part of what you're thinking that you agree towards more than the latter. It could be X and Y, and indirectly you could be relatable to X more than Y, and that's fact. You can't just be neutral entirely. When it comes to our thought, we're not quite the same, because we like to not fit into structures right now or frameworks. You know, it's a rebellious act. Thought is seen as a rebellious act now. You're just thinking in the opposite direction because that's probably what's in trend, you know, because people like to disagree more than agree lately. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing. That's absolutely important to stimulate thought and change and development. Yes, that's needed. But when you lose a sense of structure, whether it's ideology or your lifestyle, that influences your mind immensely. Yes. The way you think is completely shaped by the way you live and the way you speak and the way you articulate yourself. All of those reflects your mind. Someone who speaks very quickly is often thought to be someone who's got many thoughts in his head, who can't sort of process and articulate his or her views. Someone who talks very slowly is seen to be as someone who's got themselves together or has their thoughts collected. And these are all reflected indirectly. We are really our thoughts. You know, you can see a person's confidence by the way of expression. You can see the way someone writes through the way they speak and the way they articulate themselves. Like the expression of thought is so profound in reflecting the way our mind works. Language is an entirely different topic because language can be many things and words can be interpreted in many ways. But having structure is really, really important, because if your mind doesn't have a structure, your thoughts will never have a structure in its manifestations. The reality will be an anarchy, you know, it's just going to be an absolute thoughtful blunder if that's possible, because, you know, you're not being mindful about what you're thinking. You've had this one thought, let's say for quite some time, and the outcome isn't as what you thought. But that's because you haven't contemplated how realistic your thought is. What you're trying to manifest is ideal for you. I mean, we don't really ever know unless, I mean, the only way to know is to find out, they say. And there is so much paradox and irony in all of these sayings, because you really don't know the outcome of a thought until you make it into a tangible reality, whether it's an investment, whether it's education, whether it's a book, whether it's a trip, an experience, all of these things. Yes, the future is uncertain, and the only thing that's certain is our thought. But having a structure in the way we think helps us shape that outcome in the future, doesn't it? Like you can predict the outcome to a certain extent. The probability is always 50-50 or 75-25, depending on the circumstances. Having said that, you have some probability in the prediction if you are structured in the way you think. And something that's really triggered or perhaps provoked thought in me would be the way our minds think these days, especially millennials. You know, I mean, I don't know if I fit into the millennial group. I think I do, but I think I do. But it's just, it's very interesting, because Daniel, they could be talking about one thing in a moment, and the next moment, you know, they've gone all the way, you know, to La La Land, because that's how quick we are in changing our mind. But that's because we have no position of accountability, right? You're not accountable to your thoughts, so you just keep wandering in your head.
Oh, well, oh, no. Well, a few things, you know, first off, it should be noted, I think it was William James who said something along the lines where he said, you know, you notice in these free will debates, you always have to argue people out of the belief of free will, not into the belief of free will. And the point he was getting at is that people practically from their common life know that they have control over what they do. And it's until we read some, you know, philosophy books or whatever, that then we're convinced we don't, and so on and so forth. There's also something to be said about, if you believe that you don't have control over your life, well, then, yeah, you don't. And so then it proves to be true. It necessarily verifies itself. I think thinking in particular, to your point, where if we take a view where people have this view that you don't have control over what you think, well, if you don't have control over that, like you're saying, you don't have control over anything. You're just going to go the way you go. I think of everything. This is quite easy to show that you do have freedom of over what you think, because here's a cup. And now I'm thinking about it as white. Now I'm thinking about it as circular. Now I'm thinking about the bird on it. Now I'm thinking how I can drink. Notice how I'm choosing what I think about the cup, just quite easily, moving between my thoughts, moving between different things. I'm not free to let it go and it doesn't break. I'm not free to change it into a different cup. I'm not free, but I can instantaneously decide what I think about this cup. There's no feeling that I must think about the handle before I think about the milk in it. I'm choosing the order. I'm choosing which hand it's in. It's quite obvious. And they say, well, they did that experiment where they showed the electricity reached the finger before the brain, therefore you don't have free will. First off, that we don't have any trace. You don't have in that experiment to show you the sequence of event that led to that electricity of which you could have had control over. Second, that only would even maybe kind of suggest that on very simple actions you don't have full control. It wouldn't necessarily mean you had no control. And showing that my finger moves before my brainwave gets there does not show that my brainwave I can't move between my brain waves. You still got to prove to me that I can't move between my brain waves freely, I guess, my neuron free, like I was on the cup. You see what I'm saying? That experiment, even if you bought the finger experiment that they did, that the doctor, his name starts with an L, that's very famous, and everyone uses that to prove that we don't have free. Even if that experiment was valid, which has come under a lot of critique, that would not be an experiment that showed you didn't move between your thoughts freely. So at most, if you take that quite seriously, then you should really focus on your mind and training your mind and controlling your mind. And if indeed you come to control, well, it simply must be the case that what you think has an impact on your future. If I think that the wedding that I have to work next weekend is going to be happening next weekend, or that the bride is going to be there, then I am going to commit a series of actions to show up at the wedding venue at X time. My thinking structures what I do in my present, that therefore brings about a certain future that I think about. This is where I think Hegel's absolute is quite important, because he always wants us to think about the future as a present event. The future is present, because you are literally designing your you are always designing your present in terms of your future. Like you're always the present is always in the future, a moment later. Like even if you walk to the refrigerator, your present is thus shaped by your future. So your thinking is always future oriented, and it is simultaneously future oriented in a manner that is informing your present. So really the only way you control, since I cannot with my thinking change materiality instantly, other than with picking up the cup or whatever, but I can't change the environment instantaneously, the most clear way that I can change my present would be through my thinking about the future, that then shapes what I bring into reality that could change my material condition, or how I lift my hand, or what job that I have, and so on and so forth. But if you don't believe that thinking can change the future or change where you go, or so forth and so on, then you will not carry out the activities by which to get disciplined thinking as opposed to overthinking. And if you overthink, well, then you don't have control over your thinking, and therefore you will not bring about a different future than what just is caused unto you, or what happens. And this is the horror. That will seem to confirm you were right. If you choose to decide you don't have a control over your future, well, then you're proven right. So it's kind of total, like whatever side of this coin you choose to take, then it's going to prove itself. It's going to be the case. And so it's very, very critical to choose well. And, with the structure thing you were saying, the issue is that without sociological givens, we now have to create the structure for ourselves. So which is quite different. We have to decide for ourselves what the structure is. And like you said, if you don't have structure, there's a problem. Also, just to the point you're getting at, there always is structure. It's just a question if we acknowledge it or not. And actually what's so critical is to, in fact, acknowledge it, because if you don't, well, one, you're still going to think in that structure and you're not going to change it. You're not going to have control over it. And then two, you may get trapped in a structure that you don't want to be in, that makes it to where you must always overthink, where the possibility of deep thinking is not there because the structure will not allow it. And thus your life becomes merely the structure. And I think this goes back to what we were saying about the river, that you can control the direction. If you know the structure is there, if you know you're going to live in a structure, if you know, Howard Zinn had this line where he said, it's impossible to be neutral on a moving train. It's impossible to be neutral on a moving train. I really like that. Like you said, you're always, you can't be neutral, right? Well, if you know that, if you're always going to be the structure, then you focus instead on moving the structure, on changing the direction of the structure so that you can freely then move according to that structure. But if you don't even believe the structure is there, or if you believe there's merely the structure, ergo that you're merely reacting, that you're never responding, Well, then you can't ever become skilled or trained in disciplined deep thinking as opposed to overthinking. And as a result, the way that you form your future / present, because they're always informing one another, will be out of your hands. They'll be completely out of your hands. And before handing it back, and of course, if that's the case, you will therefore feel like you were right to think you didn't have control over your future, because you freely chose a world where you didn't have control over your freedom, over your thoughts. And therefore you get a world where you don't have control of your thoughts, because that's what you chose. You chose determinism, and therefore will make it seem to be the case that determinism is true.
I think when you think about perspective versus thought, like the freedom of choice, we can look at a glass of water and think the glass is half full, or we could think the glass is half empty.
Mm-hmm.
And that's perspective, positive or negative.
Right.
Thinking would be acknowledging there is water in the glass. Perspective would be how we see it.
Yes.
Now, what shapes our perspective? It is completely, and I feel like it's a complete external factor, because positive, negative, we can't really be positive in a dire situation unless we choose to be. Our first reactive instinct would be negative. It could be sadness, empathy, remorse, guilt, regret. But then we rise above it, or we choose to rise above it. There's a choice in perspective in comparison to thought. It's almost like where the point about thought being certain, it's also, there is a sense of certainty with it being a positive or a negative thought. It's the perspective that, gives it some fluidity, where it shifts from being positive to negative or negative to positive. And I think it's quite interesting that perspective has a profound effect on the outcome of our future. Like you said, Hegel said, we're in preparation of the future by living the present. Yes, the present is the future. It's the little blocks that sort of makes the building of the future, the very foundation. But that is so affected by perspective.
Yes.
Because if we choose to look at it in a certain way, that determines all the possible outcomes.
Yes.
So could we say the fate of thought is completely dependable on perspective? It is. Because you could predict X is going to happen if I do ABC, but it could be Y. And in the end of the day, you might just choose to agree, oh, perhaps this was what the outcome was meant to be, even though it's not what I thought. But that's you controlling the fate of thought, because it's your perspective. That is not the outcome you initially wanted, but you've accepted the new reality or the outcome of what you thought in the beginning. So how does sort of perspective come into play in the fate of thought? Yes, the future remains uncertain, but the future can be whatever we choose to accept. It is entirely up to us to think this is exactly where I needed to be. This is the universe unfolding. This is what the outcome was always supposed to be. And you could see it as something better than what you initially planned, or something far worse than what you initially wanted. But you're just one switch away. It's the perspective from positive to negative that really determines how you respond or accept the fate of your thought. Oh, yeah. Yes, there's also a part where you expect instant tangible results of your thoughts. You want the manifestation to be instant. It could be a thought about someone, someone's been on your mind, and you instantly expect to get in contact with them or get a response from them, or to be approached by them. But that doesn't really happen because yes, I mean, telepathic communication does exist, but it doesn't exist in the way it does in films, where you think of a person and they just randomly appear. That only happens in George Clooney's films, not in reality. That's not how reality works at all. But yeah, I believe that a lot of our perspective often tends to be negative, because we want immediate, instant, tangible results of our thoughts. If it's a lifelong process, or if it's a tedious, long process that has to be done over a period of time, you start questioning. You think, was it really worth, was my thought really worth giving an attempt? So sometimes the fate of thought or the outcome of your thought also depends on how instantly you expect a response or a reaction.
Yes. Yes. Oh, well, time is a massive component of this. You know, a few things. One, it's so critical when people talk about us not being determined, not having freedom, that they usually make physical examples, like, you know, of two billiard balls hitting across the table, cause and effect. But the key is that freedom comes out in things like perspective. You know, also too, the very fact that I can, you know, this is a broken part of a toy, you know, I can look at that and say, oh, it's the letter T. Oh, it's a part of a clock. Oh, it's like a crane thing, or it's a hammer. Like instantaneously, I could take this object and pretend to see it as a hammer, as a clock part, as maybe a springboard for mice. The very fact that I'm able to do that, just instantly fly between all the possibilities, that's evidence of freedom. That's evidence we have control of our thought, because I can just so instantaneously choose to see this as different objects. It's like an imaginative game. Well, in the same way, you know, I do have control over what the issue is the time scale. Okay, so if I say, okay, well, I want to be, you know, I want to start a entrepreneurship company. All right, well, the likelihood that tomorrow you are going to have a successful entrepreneur company is very low. The likelihood you'll have it in 2 days is very low. But the longer the time scale, if you maintain the consistency of perspective about achieving that goal, then the more possible it becomes. It's relative to the time scale. In the same way, like it's when they have a storm approaching, you know, when it's 10 days out, like the range is really wide, they're not sure. And as it gets closer, it kind of zooms in. It's almost a reverse with thinking. Like the likelihood of making it is very far out. It's not very but it actually zooms in the more you stay consistent on it. And freedom comes out through time. You know, freedom is really manifest in time, but all of our experiments or all of our tests for freedom are like now. They're like instantaneous. It's like, do I control if I pick up this cup or not? Well, we did some experiments to show that brain waves reach before the thought and so on and so forth. Okay, but have you shown that the brain waves of becoming an entrepreneur, like, did that same sequence? Like, of course not. Like, once you get into more complicated, there's just an assumption that the little experiment, that all of reality is an add up of those smaller parts. That would thus mean you don't have control over your future. When there's something we talk about in, you know, economics and called emergent results, where you know, there are holes that can be not found in the parts and cannot be reduced to the parts easily. That can be the play, and we also have reason to think that is the play by the ability of the brain, the case. I was saying play the case by the fact that the brain can so easily transform what it sees. So the time factor is very important, and perspective is a critical part of it. You choose the. I think the issue that happens is that people feel like, oh, I can do anything. They feel like it's false to say that. They feel like it's a lie to say that. They feel like, oh, I can do anything. No, you know, I was born in this condition. I have these skills. I have, you know, I can imagine I could be a Major League Baseball player, but no, at this age, that's not really possible. They feel like it's ingenuine, that it's not true. But the issue that is we're talking about, you're capable of doing anything within the structure of your life. We're talking, this goes back to the structure conversation, right? You know, with certain genes, with certain living conditions, with certain capabilities, then you can do anything within that range. Now, this, of course, is where the skill of discernment is really critical, because then you have to ask yourself, well, what then is given about my life? What am I actually capable of? And you have to discern that. I mean, it's also like when people say, oh, well, you should get over that event that happened when the people rejected you at the, you know, at the debating society. You should get over that, right? You know, you should stop thinking about it. Well, you know, that what's very difficult is you feel like, well, that would be a lie because I did blow it. It did go wrong. And so, you know, if I act like it didn't go wrong, that would be a problem. So people feel like they're being ingenuine, or they're not being honest to change perspective. But then the question simply becomes, well, what is your metric? You know, instead of like this, like, what is your metric? Well, is your metric that you convince yourself that what happened in the debating society was good? Well, then that would be a lie, because it was bad. It didn't go so well for you. Or is your metric that you're going to learn from it? Or is your metric that I won't do it again? What is the thing that you're learning about your past as you go into the future, right? You know, the other thing too is sometimes I was going to say, one of the problems is that our brain is naturally negative. It's kind of a lizard brain. We want to survive. And so here's the, this is why it's really important to capture our thoughts, to control our thoughts. Because if our thinking makes our future present and our brain is naturally negative, then our brain will naturally create a bad future. We will naturally make a bad future if we do not take the time to own it. So that's like, you know, because that's why we're like philosophy, learning organized thinking is like not an option. You must do it because your brain is naturally going to think negatively. And it's also going to, here's, I guess, the point I was getting at too. Your brain also naturally remembers the past negatively as well. Like it remembers all of the bad things and not the good things. Or here's the other thing, it will do the reverse. Like if you, like, let's say you were at a job that you kind of made a decision you needed to leave. Okay. And it was actually a good decision to leave. Well, then as you go, maybe 6 months later, because, coworkers are saying, they're calling and they wish you were there, and you look at your bank account and so on, what you'll suddenly do is only think about the good times at work. And you won't think of all the bad times and the reasons that you left your job. You'll think about the good. And so then you'll start thinking it was a stupid decision, when actually, no, you need to think clearly. Wait, there were reasons you left that job. There were reasons you did that. But since your brain is always assuming that you're doing it wrong, because I guess biologically, the brain has found it safer to assume you're doing it wrong, because if you're not doing it wrong, then you survive. But if you're doing it wrong, well, then you'll figure it out and you'll go back, or you'll do stuff different and you survive. So your brain, it's a survival tactic to assume you're doing it wrong. Like whatever it is, that you made a bad decision in the past, that what you're going to do in the future is bad, because then you don't take any risks. You don't change anything. And biologically, you are naturally oriented to not change anything, to stay in a stable state, because you're alive right now. And if you're alive right now, well, then we want to keep doing that, because the only goal of biology is to keep you alive. So your brain evolutionary is like to keep you alive. But then, of course, that means your brain is always is always going to interpret the past, that if you change something that was wrong, you shouldn't have, whatever you change, you shouldn't have done, because your brain doesn't want you to change in the future. If it was possible that you made a good change in the past, then it's possible you could make a good change in the future. Your brain doesn't want that. We don't want risk. Your brain doesn't want risk at all. And so when you start talking about the ability to change the future and the present relative to thinking, you're talking about taking risk. Oh man, brain don't like that. Brain don't like that. So the brain's going to fight that. So you got to fight that. You've got to literally take time in your life to fight that part of your brain, because it's always going to make you feel like whatever decision you made in the bad were bad. They were bad decisions, unless it's here's the key. Unless it's so obvious that it was a good decision that your brain can't do anything about it. But then you know what your brain does? Your brain makes you forget all the times you made good decisions that can't decide. They like amnesia. You just forget about it, and you see yourself as only making bad decisions or decisions you couldn't. Your brain has your brain is incredibly talented at convincing you that you're always wrong, because it wants a stable state. It doesn't want you. The brain, in wanting a stable state, therefore doesn't want you to believe you're free. Because if you're free, you could change things, and that means you could take risk, and that means you could die. So the brain wants you to believe that you're determined. And yet it's really funny, because that means the brain is simultaneously the source of your freedom in thought, just like you described, because you can change your perspective. And yet that very brain is also in the business of you not changing your perspective. And so that gets into, Michelle and I are always talking about how the brain is the frenemy. The brain is the frenemy. It's your friend. It's what you need to think, but it's also your enemy. So so you have to wrestle with your brain, almost like Jacob with God, right? In the Old Testament, like wrestle with your brain. And that means you must wrestle with your naturally negative, overthinking mind that's going to make your future bad to keep a stable state so that you survive. You have to wrestle that into disciplined thinking and deep thinking so that you can be free and have control over your present and future.
Yes, absolutely. And I think about the fact that our brain is naturally negative plays an immense role in today's society when it comes to mental health, Daniel, yes. Because that is something that everyone diagnoses themselves with, saying they suffer with depression, distorted thoughts, or the inability to understand themselves or place them somewhere in the world, their right. Self of identity. And the other thing about, we can't be everything. That's true. But we can be whatever we put our mind to. So right. How realistic are we? There are different ways of thinking. Yes, we could be pragmatic, idealistic, realistic. And it's very important to put your mind into things that are realistic for you. Because like you said, if you're past a certain age and you want to play baseball, you really can't do it anymore. You've got to start it young, or start it at a certain age where it promotes agility and tactics and all of that. I don't know much about baseball, you can clearly tell.
I don't either. I just made an example.
I thought you'd be a fan. Moving on. So we've got to sort of put our mind into thoughts or manifestations that are realistic to us.
Yes.
That also comes with the identification of self. If you don't know who you are or what you're capable of, how do you know what's a reality for you or what's realistic for you?
Right.
You don't. That remains a question. So yes, thought also provokes trial and error. You've got to try certain things, and they could work out, they could not. It's like when you do online shopping and you see an outfit on a certain model and you think that outfit's going to suit you, but when you actually purchase it and it arrives, it does not. You know, it wasn't realistic. You know, you were just picturing yourself in the illusion of what you thought would suit you. But when it arrives, it really doesn't suit your body type, and that doesn't change your worth or the aesthetics of yourself, but it just changes your perspective. It just becomes negative.
Right.
Because you expect it to look like something else. You were trying to mirror another person, and that is just you setting yourself up for failure, because you can't be that individual, even if in your head you want to be that person.
Oh yeah.
And that's where you tend to have like the issue of split personality, you know, and bipolarity, because all of these things are really in the head, and people don't like being told this. Sometimes if someone speaks to you and is being quite dramatic about a situation, and if you say, oh, but it's all just in your head, you get offended.
Right.
You don't like hearing that. But it is very true. It begins in your head. It becomes a reality once you heighten the situation in your head.
Yes.
So, yes, you know, we are wired to think negatively. How negative is entirely up to us.
Oh yeah.
You know, we can entertain a thought. We can tell ourselves, okay, this is just me being pessimistic. Or perhaps, yes, perhaps what I'm trying to do might not suit me, or I might not land my dream job, or, you know, get the service I expected from a restaurant that I found on TripAdvisor. But that disappointment comes with your expectation, doesn't it?
Oh yeah.
You think so highly of something, you've put that situation on a pedestal, you've over glamorized the situation in your head. You know, you've heightened a situation and its outcome more than you should have. So you're disappointed by its mediocrity, because it's all subjective, isn't it? Subjective to thought. Right. How profound something is, or how mediocre or basic or bland something tends to be, is entirely up to perspective yet again. Oh, yeah. And the way our brain accepts, reacts, and responds to it. There have been often times that I've been quite an impulsive person, frankly speaking, and that's why I do a lot of thinking, because I feel like one of my shortcomings would be impulsiveness, and I tend to sort of react in my head before I do personally or physically. And lately, I've just taken a step back to sort of self-reflect, and that's what provoked this conversation as well, Daniel. Self-reflection, where you think to yourself, am I disappointed, whatever the situation? It could be just a bad day or an experience with someone, where I've thought to myself, has the situation failed me, or has my thoughts failed me? Was it my expectations that failed me? Perhaps this was what the reality always was. What you were expecting was just far-fetched. You thought too far of a situation, or you read too much into a situation that you shouldn't have. So you set yourself up for failure. And that is the fate of being overly optimistic or having too much expectation.
But I was thinking with thoughts, how I wonder too, and I mentioned this to you, Sanduni, and I had mentioned, we spoke a little bit about this, how I wonder if with thoughts, you know, in a way, I was thinking about the word habit and how it's related to habitat. You know, a lot of times our habits create our homes in a way. And so I wonder sometimes with thoughts, if a lot of it is really just the fact that you have a habit of thinking in a certain way. Or like your reaction to something puts you in certain thoughts that you habitually do, you know, like, you know, friends not responding, so I'm going to assume X, Y, Z, Q, whatever. And just the fact that you have a habit of doing that, maybe it does like stem from some sort of insecurity or things that you have to work out within your own self. And I don't know why. It's weird. The energy that you take on, starting to read into something, why isn't that same energy used towards just thinking through why you shouldn't be reading into it? It's just interesting how our brains do that. And I wonder if habituation, kind of where we feel at home, even if it's kind of painful to stay there, it still feels like at least it's home, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the habit of our thoughts. So I was thinking a little bit about that. Sadie, do you want to comment on that a little bit? I know we spoke a little in our messages about that topic, but
yes, you're right to think that yes, habits form our home, but there is a downside to it, because sometimes we form habits with great expectations. We form a certain sense of habit. For example, let's say you decide to spend 20 minutes a day doing yoga. And that comes with the expectation of calming yourself down, perhaps toning up your physique. All of those expectations come with that habit. Now, what people fail to realize or acknowledge or come into terms with is that habits take time.
Right.
They take time to reach their full potential. You could start meditating on day one and you could be all the way in another country. You can't just control your thoughts right away. It takes practice. Like you can't have an instant manifestation. You can't instantly reap the benefits of a habit that you form. Yes, it makes a difference every single day. If you try and wake up early, the first 2 days you're likely to feel sluggish if that's your body coping with it. But on the third day you feel refreshed. And then comes the positive affirmation where your brain accepts, oh, perhaps this was a good thought. Perhaps manifesting or indulging in this habit was the right thing to do. But do we ever just take a leap of faith with our thoughts? We don't really do that. We always calculate the pros and cons. Every thought somehow seeks a reaction or a response. Do we ever think just because we want to think of something? Do we ever just express because it was on my mind, I was thinking of you, and that's it, I just wanted to let you know I was thinking of you? No, we expect a response that says, oh, I was thinking of you too. We talked about you yesterday. It's completely human to want that reactive response. It could come from a good side of you. It could come from a place of goodness, but you're expecting, an expectation sets you up for your disappointment. It's inevitable. Right. It's absolutely inevitable, because yes, pain is completely inevitable, but suffering is optional. And a lot of suffering is inflicted in thought. It's how we think about a situation. Yeah. Michelle, Daniel and I was talking about, perspective, and I gave an example of the glass being half full or half empty. It's completely perspective. It could be something negative, or it could be something positive, but it's just completely your outlook towards it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Such as thought, such as the formation of habit, you could want to do something right for yourself or the people you live with, but when you don't see that instant tangible result where you think, oh, yes, it is a success, I'm just fitter, I'm flexible, I am fresh, fresh as a daisy, you expect that instant gratification and confirmation of the outcome. You want it instantly, in a blink of an eye, and that just sets us up for disappointment. And the negativity that it inspires within you is immense, and it has a long-term effect. We were also talking about mental health, and how that affects you. Mm-hmm. A lot of times when we think about the effect that our mind has on us, we don't even know the magnitude of our thoughts. Sometimes we don't even know the magnitude of our own thoughts. It is so profound. It can completely change your physique, in the sense, you could be agitated, you could be twitching, you could be itching, you could have reactions that are completely trauma inducing because of the way you think, because of your perspective. And that again brings me to the point, and I'd like to know what you think, Michelle, that often perspective happens to be the fate of thought. Mm-hmm. Because we could think something, and the way we accept the outcome is entirely up to perspective. I could have wanted to have a different outcome, but when the outcome is different, I tell myself, perhaps this is better. Just like that, just like that. I was manifesting something completely different. And now I've agreed to accept the reality of today. And that's completely perspective. So then where does it leave us with fate?
Where does it leave us with fate? Yes. Well, I do think it seems like then it's, as Daniel had mentioned initially about the relationships too. I mean, it seems like you're right that perspective is in a sense what gives us the sense of what our fate is, right? What we make of our fate with our perspective, right? With our perspective. And our perspective is coming from thoughts, right? For the most part. I mean, it's the thoughts of how we see the world. How we see the world has to do with how we think about the world. And that then gives us our lens, like I was saying, the lens that you have today, that's going to then influence your day to day. So I think that it is very true that perspective is very much connected with the fate of our thoughts. It might be everything to it actually, because a lot of it is just how we are going to perceive X outcome. I think it's true that what you said about the glass half full and empty, because I remember when our oldest son asked me just out of the blue, well, what's the difference between a half glass full and a half glass empty, mommy? And it was just so funny because I was like, well, nothing, I suppose. It's really just how you see it if you want to see it. And it was just, children ask questions like that. And it always just, in a very powerful way, illuminates such a simple but profound point. So I think something that it makes me think of what you've just brought up, Sanduni, is sort of like, I wonder for somebody who feels stuck, perhaps, for somebody who feels stuck in their thoughts, this whole thought of what we're talking about is like, well, you can also change your thoughts, right? You can shift them, and that's going to make things, you can make things better for yourself. But I wonder why it is that someone would feel stuck, right? When really you could change the words in your mind, basically. You could change the way you see things, and then it could actually unlock things a little bit. It might take time, like you said, the habit, right? Forming a new habit. Maybe you have all these old habits that make you have these thought patterns, but you can make new habits. But I don't know, I've really been thinking about this lately. Like, what is it that keeps somebody stuck in a thought pattern? And, is there something about just having some sort of, and maybe this is where the practice and the thinking really come into play, because if you want to do things different, I think it probably is the case though that people who feel stuck, or if anyone's ever felt stuck in their life, most people, humans have at some point, it's usually the case that though they think they're trying, they might actually not be, it's, or maybe they are trying, but it's like a very slight variation on the recipe. So they're getting pretty much the same, that thing that comes out of the oven. It's like they need to try some completely different recipe. And it probably has a lot to do with fear, honestly. I think fear keeps a lot of, can keep humans from really branching out in their thoughts and branching out in their practices. Because if the fear is there, then doesn't matter how much you want to get out of being stuck. If you're not willing to kind of think something different or try something different, then you won't really get out of that place.
Right. Well, a few things. Naturally, your brain, all of us start off with habits that make us survive primarily, that makes us risk averse. You could also make a distinction between sight and perspective. Your brain doesn't really want you to think there's a difference between your sight of the cup and perspective of the cup, because the moment you learn you can separate them, well, then you can exist in a different world. And what if that world is bad and gets you killed, right? So the brain does not want you to think there's a difference between sight and perspective. So you naturally are going to form habits that keep you in your now, whatever your now is, because you're now, we know that in your now, you're alive. So the brain's like, well, stay there. Because that my only goal, the enemy side of the brain, its only goal, the lizard brain, as Seth Godin calls it, I just want you to be alive. I don't care if you're happy. I don't care about anything. I just want you.
Because it also just wants you to be alive.
It just wants you. Well, right. So, so you have this. So if we're going to develop habits that, like you're saying, make a sense of a different home that's more positive, then it has to be actively done. It has to be actively done. I think a lot of people believe that, positive thinking, that they're being inauthentic, that they're lying, that it's not true, for example. And you see, but this is, there's a difference between the thought, I could start a successful entrepreneurship and I can make $100,000 in credit card debt vanish. There's a difference in those thoughts. And you see, one of the reasons it's actually very, very critical to understand the power of your thinking right now, whoever is hearing this right now, is because there are situations that are harder to get out of than others, right? If you drive drunk and get in a car wreck and now you have a lawsuit and you've hurt your leg, it is very difficult to get out of that situation. However, before you get in the car and drive and do X, Y, and Z, you can think, my life is worth living. I shouldn't do this, and thus avoid that road of causality. So even in what a lot of people will say is, well, I'm in a situation where I'm $100,000 in credit card debt, and therefore thinking doesn't matter. It's not going to have as easy of an impact, but there was a part in your chain somewhere in the call of your life where thinking more actively and more structuredly could have made a difference. The issue is that, well, one of the reasons you do want to become disciplined in your thinking is precisely because there are choices you can make that have real consequences, that can get you in situations that are dire. But on the flip side, there's also choices you can make that have really positive consequences, that are really good, that do in fact increase the quality of your life. So again, there's a symbiotic there is a dance between causation and freedom. Things you can control, things you can't control, things you can control, right? But it's not the case. The question is, like a lot of these pieces of advice about positive thinking, they are situationally embedded. And a lot of times, so if you're judging it just relative to your now, well, no, you need to look at the entire framework. You need to look at how cause and effect and different things happen and how they work. And also, even for the person who's $100,000 in credit card debt, well, it's not like negative thinking is going to get you out of $100,000 of credit card debt. It's not like overthinking is going to get you out of credit card debt. It would not follow. What ends up happening is the loss of hope. They just don't care anymore. That's what ends up happening more so. A lot of times when people say thinking doesn't make a difference, what they're saying is, I don't have hope. Like they've given up. It's more of they're claiming that thought is powerless. But really, it's just that they don't care anymore to think, which is a slight distinction, but it means a lot because it is not thought itself which is powerless. It's that they have chosen that in their situation, it's not worth using the power, that the power can never be great enough to overcome whatever they've gotten them in. But that doesn't mean that thought is actually powerless. That means that you've chosen not to wield it, because even somebody who's $100,000 in credit card, it is not actually true that you can never get out of it. It may take 20 years, it may take a long time, but it's actually not true that it's impossible to get out of it. You've just decided that it feels impossible to get out of it, and therefore you're thinking that you could get out of it is false, right? But that, of course, is a thought. The thought that thinking doesn't help is a thought. So, thinking is always choosing. You always have to decide the role of thinking, which in itself takes thinking. So there's a meta layer here that you need to take responsibility for. That very often you don't, because you just claim that thinking doesn't make a difference because the world taught you that. You act like it's the world that taught you that, when really it was the thinking you had that led you up to this situation that is now more difficult. That tends to be why people make that conclusion.
I think that's very true, Daniel. Like, it really is, the thinking is what creates the outcome of whatever the thought is, and how we perceive the reaction towards the thought. What about the thin line? When we think of something and we want to express it, there could be a time where we don't express it instantly. Sure. I could have thought about something last night that probably did not come out today because it just went away. Sure. Or what about if you think of something and then you express it? And somewhere between the lines between thinking and expression, it loses its meaning. Because when you're expressing it to another individual. And then comes in their perspective of that thought. Because they give you their 2 cents, right? They give you your insight where they say, oh, well, I disagree, or I think X, Y, and Z. And then you're influenced by that. And then your thought is modified. It's revamped. That's not what you initially thought. Somewhere between thinking, expressing, and getting feedback, the thought has completely changed. Sure. Perhaps not. Perhaps you won't see the difference, and it's only changed if you acknowledge the change. If you don't, well, it remains the same. So what about the fate of thought between expression and thinking? There's a huge change there, where the language that we use to express something and the language that is used by the other person who is receiving your thought. There's so much communication and dialogue between the two, where the initial thought is somehow perhaps dismissed or you think, oh, it's been improved now because you've got an existing validation of your thought or a confirmation. And you might think your thought is irrelevant if the feedback you get is negative.
Mm-hmm.
So where does that leave us with the fate of thought? Sometimes it could just be shorter than a lifespan of a mosquito. You know, it's till it lands on the wrong person, and that's it. You know, swapped, you're gone, just like that. What do you think?
Well, I'll say something really quick. I think this, when you're talking, it did make me get back to thinking about being stuck, because I wonder sometimes if, you know, I mean, people can feel stuck, obviously, just as an individual, right? But I think often people do feel more of that stuck feeling because of relationships, you know, because of like they maybe want to make some sort of change, or I don't know, see something different happen or play out. And I wonder sometimes if that's also where the stuck feeling can come, because what your thoughts, you know, in your head, it's like when I was little and I'd be like, you know, I'd see this beautiful scene of the ocean in a boat and I'd be like, oh, I want to paint that or draw that. And I was so little and I just thought that like, oh, I'll put a pen to paper and it's going to look just like it. And then I would try and I'd be like, oh goodness, it looks nothing like it. You know, it's just a very mere representation. But that's the same idea, you know, it's like in my head, it's very, in one's head, it's very crisp and clear and very articulated, and you understand what you mean, and you agree with yourself, and you are very passionate about whatever the outcome is you're hoping to get with these words and this thought. And yet when you go to express it, I mean, it can literally just kind of like bounce off the person and just sort of like, you know, fade off into nowhere, you know, and it's very hard in that way. I think that's what maybe does keep people more in their thoughts sometimes, in not that that's always negative, but in a negative sense, when they get stuck with their thoughts, because they feel like, I just can't get what's up here into your mind in a way that makes sense, that you can understand where I'm coming from. And not that they have to necessarily agree, but just that they can understand, so that they know why you're saying what you're saying. And I think that's interesting, because, you know, that it's almost like, well, maybe you could kind of think about different ways to say something, but how much of it at the end of the day is just being able to have some sort of sense of, okay, I might not agree with you and I might not understand exactly what you're saying, but I see you're trying to say something. I see you're trying to communicate something to me. And you clearly feel very, you know, passionate about it, whatever it is. And I don't know, at least that could maybe be some sort of middle ground to at least plant the little seed of thought there that you could help grow together, or something like that. I don't know.
Well, no, I mean, you know, absolutely. A lot of times this problem comes out in relationship, because when you're sitting in a room thinking about your thoughts, they're great. You know, there's no, you know, they're not checked and balanced or anything like that, right? There's a big difference. So a few things. There's a big difference between thinking about communicating in terms of expressing what you want to say and thinking about being understood. Like the way you communicate is very different. Like, for example, like you may have a deep, you know, a big philosophical idea that you express, but because you didn't use any metaphors, because you used a lot of complex language, they don't understand it. But you expressed it, but they don't understand it. But if you instead think that I think you have to ask yourself what you're doing when you're speaking. Are you expressing or are you communicating? Because if you ask yourself, you express when you're alone. But the moment you're in relation, you're communicating. You need to realize that that's the game you're playing, because if you think it's not, then you're going to be expressing and then they won't get it and you'll feel alone and sad. And we don't want to feel alone and sad. So the skill set to express is different from the skill set to communicate. And you can express without using metaphor. You can express using complicated language. You can express jumping around. You can express not using complete sentences. You can express having a lot of semicolons, but you may not be understood. You may not be communicated. So question one, are you following the rules, quote unquote, the skills, the art form of communication, or just expression? And if you're doing expression and you conflate expression with communicating, you're going to perhaps be setting yourself up to be sad. Second, it doesn't help that you have a society that doesn't train in, you know, rhetoric, letter writing, you know, quiet time. We don't, because frankly, what ends up happening, it's actually in the quiet times that you craft the skills of what you bring to communication. Because, you know, because even like if you realize that you need to be good at communication, then what you actually do in quiet time will be, you're not merely going to express, you are going to express, but then you're going to chisel to say, okay, well, all right, that's a good, I've expressed out good ideas, but now how do I state them in a manner, have lower syllable counts in the sentences, you know, don't make them so long. How do I do it, chisel in a way that I can then communicate it. You know, you have a different thought process. There's a difference between thinking like a writer and thinking like an editor. And the more you do it, the more you start thinking like an editor. Fourth or third, I can't remember, you know, numbers are hard. There's also something to be said here about why it is so critical to be aware of who you are letting into your inner circle, right? Who are the people you are communicating with? You know, if you have people that simply don't care about ideas, then you could be the best communicator on planet Earth. And whatever you say, they're just not going to care, right? But here's the thing, you then, like, if you don't actually discern that they don't care, you may think that their lack of care is evidence of your fault, right? That you didn't do it right. And so then you're stuck like Sisyphus, always pushing a boulder and never making progress. So it's quite critical that you discern, but this is where you have to have the skill of discernment. You have to discern the nature of the people around you of whom you're trying to get feedback with, you know, or who you're getting feedback. Not all feedback is equal. You know, not all people are going to have the same investment in ideas or thinking that other people do. So you have to have the skill of discerning your environment. If you are talking with someone who just simply, it's obvious, does not like philosophical conversation, but darn it, you're going to force it, well, then you're going to just be sad, because no matter how much you do it, it doesn't work. But then there's also something about, well, this is an example. How much can your positive thinking that one day they're just going to like it, that your positive thinking, if I just get a really good communicator, then they'll wake up to the you know, the wonders and glory of philosophy. Well, you're not being realistic. And in fact, in a sense, you're actually starting to objectify the person, because you're treating them like an object that you can kind of change around and unlock if you just get the right communication. So this is where the skills, I think the question is being on the fate of thought. It becomes a complicated kind of network of variables of what is the nature of the people you are speaking to? Have you discerned the people you're seeking feedback with? Have you been wise about who you surround yourself and what environments you put yourself in? Because the other thing, like you said, Sanduni, people often we communicate because we want to get positive feedback. We want people to tell us it's good or that it's smart. That might be bad. What if they're just like telling you it's good when it's not? You know, what if like they're just like feeding, you know, blowing smoke, right? Is it necessarily good to get positive feedback? So here's the other thing. You also have to develop the skill to discern the quality of your own words, to discern the quality of what you're saying, like to have a sense of if you're actually successfully communicating according to the principles of good communication, that it's actually a good idea according to what constitutes a good idea. But of course, that sounds problematic because, well, what's a good idea? What are the laws of principle? But like, what are the rules of good communication? But there are rules, and you do in fact know them the more you do it. It's just like jazz. There are it seems like jazz improvisation is random. It seems like there's no logic, but there actually is very much a logic. But in order to know that logic, you must do jazz. You must enter into the conditionality of jazz to learn it. So likewise with things like this, there are in fact principles of better communication versus not, that the more you train, there are people who are better at listening than not, you know, and the more you discern those, the more, let's put it this way, the more you can put yourself in an environment that feedback about your communication is reliable, is trustable, because a lot of this conversation becomes the question of how much can you trust your positive thoughts? How much can you believe in your positive thoughts? How much can you believe in the feedback that you're getting back? Well, that if that's the case, then that puts a lot of impetus upon developing the ability to discern the right kinds of people, the right kind of environments, and the right kinds of communication. So overhanging all of this is that capacity to discern.
Yes. And I think the point about expression versus communication, especially in relationships, I think that comes expression, communication, and then there is a projection.
Yes.
We don't know which is which, but a lot of times in relationships, we tend to project. We don't express or communicate our expectations from the relationship. We project. We just expect the other individual or your respective other partner to know what you want.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, there are times when you express or communicate your wants and they don't understand. Perhaps because they don't want to understand, or they're incapable of understanding due to their own shortcomings, or because you've done a bad job at expressing yourself or communicating. That's entirely up to luck, I suppose, to a certain extent, because you just never really know. You've got to take a leap of faith, especially when it comes to relationships. Also, like I said, like you said, Daniel, about feedback. You know, it could be constructive criticism. I always believe that if I walk into a room and if I'm the smartest person in that room, I'd walk away, because I don't want to just constantly be who I am. You know, I want to take it a step up. I want to, you know, enhance my knowledge, or, you know, be intrigued by other people's thoughts and views, or else what's the point of knowing what you already know and hanging on to it? You know, there needs to be a progression of thoughts. And especially when it comes to projecting, I think it's done profoundly in intimate relationships. I remember having this conversation with Michelle where I said, hurt people tend to hurt others.
Oh, yes. Yes.
It's absolutely true, because somehow the other person's prejudice mortifies your pride. You know, you're affected by their expectations or their insecurities, where you fail to acknowledge that projection comes from their insecurity, not because you are insecure, not because you have that quality, but because they have it. And they're trying to make you think you lack what they already lack.
Yes.
And that's where manipulation comes in. Manipulation of thoughts happen immensely in relationships, because yes, we tell ourselves one thing, right? We put this individual on a pedestal and we think so highly of him or her. And then, yes, there comes a disappointment when you see something that you didn't want to see, you know, where a red flag comes through. That's inevitable. That's very likely to happen, even in the healthiest of relationships. You're likely to see someone fall short of the quality you thought they highly possessed.
Yeah.
Having said that, I believe that projection really manipulates the way we think, because especially if you're an empath or an optimist, you tend to think that your energy will somehow radiate and they will see this through. You know, you will be able to shapeshift or influence this person's mind. Sometimes you are really able to influence a person's mind, sometimes you're not. And you have to be ready with either of the outcomes. But in intimate affairs, you're not. You expect it to work, you know, you expect to walk off to the sunset together, you know, you just expect that. You want that to happen. And I think that really manipulates your mind. That's where you think, oh, I'm not being rational, because you're being emotional. We talked about the importance of emotional intelligence. But yes, you're supposed to be emotionally intelligent, not enslaved to your emotions. Right. There's a very thin line there. Yes. There's a very thin line there. You cannot be enslaved to your emotions. And if you can't acknowledge that or see the difference, you're likely to be disappointed no matter what the affair is, no matter what the situation is. Oh, yes. Even a friendship, even in families, you're likely to be disappointed because you expect something to be given. You feel you're entitled to it. You feel like this other person is obligated to serve you, or to provide, or to be there, or to console. And you set yourself up for disappointment there. But the main point I'm trying to make here is the effect of projection on the fate of our thought, and eventually shaping who we are or who we become. And especially in relationships, you never remain the person you walked into that relationship with. You come out an entirely different person. Yes. Why? It's because your mindset has changed. Your perspective has changed. Yes, sometimes, you know, your physique, your appearance changes as well. But you just, you know, you do an entire 180 and you become a completely different person because you're influenced either positively or negatively. You know, you look at someone and you're like, I don't even recognize you anymore. You know, you were never like this. You were never so positive, or you were never so negative. And I believe that manipulation through relationships or the environment we're in really affects the fate of our thoughts and eventually their outcomes. And that's why it's so important to be with individuals that challenge you, whether it's positively or negatively, who provoke thought, who stimulate a response where it's not just happiness or sadness, but where you go away and you deliberate, you think to yourself, hang on a minute, you know, he said this or she said this. Is it true? Is it relatable? Is it real? Is it going to change? You know, if the people that you're around don't provoke these questions, why are you even around them? You know, because that's all we have, right? The energy that people exchange. I mean, especially when it comes to children, for a fact. I mean, Michelle and I talk a lot about the kids, and I'm not into favoritism, but we all know that Haven is my favorite. because witty, I think it's a lot like you, Daniel. I completely see now that I've had this conversation with you. Absolutely witty and very smart. And we learn so much, don't we? Even though they're children, and just learning how to think. Yes, they're influenced by us and what we do and how we speak and how we explain things. Yet sometimes they question the reality we live in. And that makes you question for a moment. You take a step back and you're like, yes, I'm the parent who's supposed to know it all, or at least pretend that I know it all. But I really don't have an answer to that question. You know, that provokes thought. And it's so important to have that in your life, or else you're stuck. You're completely stuck there. You could be stuck in a situation merely because you've not had a change in perspective.
Right.
Well, I think that questions always are such a great accelerator of thought. You know, they're such a great jumping pad, if you will, for further thought. And I think that's so important, because often questions are too what they're going to basically like help your thought develop, right? It's like, you know, that's going to be the water to the soil that nourishes the seed, then that makes it grow. I mean, those questions are so important because too, I think it does challenge yourself, and it challenges those around you, or you're challenged by those around you with questions. And, you know, we've talked before about how questions can sometimes be like weaponized. Daniel, Zuba and Javier and I were also talking about that. It's, you know, questions can become unfortunately, I think the thing is that when we don't understand the value of thought, when we don't understand the thinking about thinking, then questions can become much more of a threat. People really can use them as weapons, or they can feel them to be weapons. They receive it and they just can only think about it in terms of, am I going to be right? Am I going to be wrong? Is the person going to, you know, is this answer going to be the right one? And I think we have to really get very far. We need to really leave that way of thinking on questions and really stay in the childlike realm, where it really is genuine curiosity and it's genuine desire to learn and, you know, explore and test things and play, you know. And I think that's really important, because, you know, I don't know why I keep on getting stuck on being stuck, but I think this also helps with the stuck thoughts, right? Because if you're in that place, so you have some sort of thought that you just feel like it's like a thought that is, you know, it's 100-pound brick, you know, and it's so sure, you're so sure that this is something true about yourself, and it's something bad. Well, why do you think that? You know, a great place to start is like, well, why do I think that about myself? Or why do I think this? Or why do I think I can't do that? Well, start to really go there, and don't be, you know, instead of just letting the question hang, really try and answer it, you know. And we've talked to, Daniel and I talked about like the quiet expression, right? Where you just take the time to express versus the communicate. This is when you're just doing it with yourself, to really go and actually write something out, or think something out, or maybe draw something out. Really take your thoughts and play with them a little bit and see if you can make some headway there. And maybe you won't on the first time around, but maybe on the second, third, fourth, you know, as if you continue on, you can make some headway there, understanding why is it that I feel so certain. Because again, it's the certainty, and often we stay there because it's comfortable, right? It's just more comfortable that way. It's not pleasant, and we kind of we say we want it to change, but really we feel very comfortable in our certainty of ourselves and what thought we have of ourselves, or of another, or of a situation. And so, yeah, I think that getting back into place of play and uncertainty and the questions is so fundamental, I think, in thought, going in a very good direction, and you know, allowing us to have maybe a new perspective on what is this fate that we are in, or we are experiencing.
Well, I mean, if human beings are incapable of questioning, then they cannot make whatever is the case is whatever is the case. Questioning is what makes it possible for humans to divide from materiality into something new. Yeah. The moment you say, is that a cup? Well, is it? You know, suddenly materiality can change. So it's really hard to imagine freedom without questioning. You know, it's hard to imagine meaningful freedom, or thinking and freedom that you could define as meaningfully distinct from random causation without questioning. You know, questioning, you were mentioning the pause and how you feel like that's where you really can start to tell that you're responding and not just reacting, this kind of pause. What is questioning but a pause? Yeah. Questioning is a pause in words. Yeah, and so it is that pause that helps you go, okay, I know I'm not just reacting because I stopped. you know, it's like if you were running toward a cliff or if something was pushing behind you, you know, you would know you weren't responding because it just pushed you. But the moment you stop, maybe it's still at your back, maybe it's still against you, but you know that if you move forward, you're choosing to let it take you forward, and therefore it's a response. Or when you go back, well, you really know that you're responding because you're pushing against the thing, you know, the reaction, the causation pushing you forward. The moment you push against it, there's no doubt that you're responding because you feel it. Like it's very often, like, to go to the earlier question, we really can tell the difference when we're responding and not just reacting when it feels hard. Like then it's just kind of obvious, you know, well, clearly it wouldn't feel hard if we were just reacting. When it starts to feel hard, that means there's something you're pushing against. And what you tend to be pushing against tends to be the force that just wants to push you along. So questions is quite critical. The other thing I would say, so you have this kind of problem too on this kind of idea you mentioned earlier about how do you tell if the future you bring about is really something you willed, or if it just happened to you, and sort of expectations and all these sort of dilemmas and different things like that. Since certainty is impossible, since we can never 100% be sure that the future we bring about is a result of response versus reaction, even though if we remember, we probably can get a good sense of it if we remember what we went through. And critically, I meant to add, the brain wants you to think that questions are always weapons and that questions are bad, because your brain doesn't want you to think you're free, because the moment you're free, you can take risk. And if you can take risk, you can die. So your brain doesn't want questions. Your brain wants questions to be enemies. It wants it to be, because it doesn't want you free. Because what would you do with that freedom? Who knows? It wants you to think you're free, because then you won't fight against your prison cell, but it doesn't want you to actually be free. So it does a lot of gymnastics that way. So since we can never get certainty about how much we're free and different things like that, the question is, what is our assumption? Like, what kind of assumptions are we going to go with? And what are the better assumptions by which to operate with? Well, so likewise, when you're talking about communicating versus just expressing and not being understood, what assumptions, how should we choose to interpret how we did? Right? How should we choose to interpret how we did? Because we can never be 100% sure if we have the right interpretation, right? So there's a kind of choice on how we choose to interpret how we did. I think the best course of action is to always interpret that you could do better. Because if you always interpret that you could do better, then if you did really good, well, then you're going to do better next time. And if you didn't do good, well, then you're going to do better next time. And simultaneously, when you're talking about looking at other people, the problem with expectations, the thing you want to discern as opposed to expect is, does the individual, if it's romantic in that language, does the person have a genuine devotion to being better at determining the good, true, and beautiful? Because that's the most important thing in the world. If they have it, since we're all going to mess up, since we're all going to make mistakes, the key attribute, the key is a commitment, which is present-based. It's not an expectation. In a sense, commitment is the opposite of an expectation, because a expectation doesn't need a commitment, because it's just going to happen. A commitment means you're going to bring it about. So you don't expect it, you make it. And so the most important characteristic in people is a genuine effort to do better, to fail better, as Cornel West says, to be more good and more true and more beautiful. And you should look for that commitment in a person. And you can tell, because that's all any of us can do. You know, we're going to commit, you know, today maybe I overthought, but, you know, I'm committed to becoming a deep thinker. And, you know, because ultimately our greatest opponent, as I like to put it, is time. Like, all of us are great today, but after, coming, 20 years in the workforce, 20 years of, irritation or whatever, we can all be the pressure cooker of time, right? But what can get us through is a genuine pursuit to do better, to be more good and more beautiful, and more true, and to look for that commitment, because that is what can kind of come through. That can. Oh, look at this guy.
He's very welcome to grace that conversation.
Yeah, maybe he'll just fall asleep. We'll see. He's so tired. Oh my goodness. Oh, look at this little dude. Oh yeah. I know. Now the question is, what is his expectation? Does he have an expectation? Yeah, what's on his mind? He's like, my parents are insane. My parents are insane.
Keep him away from your eye. Keep him away from your eye, Rochelle.
Oh yeah. So my goodness. But y'all were talking about that. Yeah, no, I think like I think you want to discern, like, you have to have some sense of what this person is going to be like in the future. Like, you can't help it. But the question is the foundation of your vision of what they're going to be like in the future based on your expectation or a commitment that you've discerned in them toward the good, the beautiful, and the true? Like, if they have a genuine commitment, well, here's the thing, then even if they mess up, because of course everyone messes up, then they'll get back up and continue down the path of the true, good, and beautiful. Oh, Grace is here too. Oh, Grace, you okay? Oh. Yeah. So no, I think it's like there's a big difference between like discerning a commitment in someone as opposed to expecting them. Like, if they're committed to the true, beautiful, and goodful, then when they inevitably mess up, they're going to stand up, keep going. What ends up happening is, if your view of a person is not based on commitments you discern, then when they like mess up in the future, they go down a different road. And then they become someone, I didn't know you would become this way. I didn't know you were like this way. Well, you see, here's the funny thing. Whenever anyone gets in a relationship, they think they know that the person is going to change through time. They genuinely think they understand that. But the issue is that you really underestimate how wide the range of possible change is if they're not bound by a very genuine commitment to the good, beautiful, and the true. And the thing is, people assume, well, if they're committed to me, then that's going to bind how much they change. No, not well, yes and no. I mean, they're not going to like change as in go live somewhere else or whatever. But you see, we're not just shaped by our relationships, but our metaphysical commitments. Like, arguably, our metaphysical commitments are what shape our individuality the most. Yeah. And you see, if you don't discern that person's metaphysical commitments, or if they don't have any, and that's usually what happens. You know, a lot of times people don't have metaphysical commitments because they don't do philosophy, they don't think about it. Well, then the problem is they're unbound. There's no range. So you have no idea what they're going to become, because we're all shaped in the image and likeness of our metaphysical commitments, and how we change. And, you know, if we fight our desires, if we believe our desires are our true self, if we need to cultivate, I could go on and list out 1,000 things here. So what ends up happening is people get in relationships and don't discern the metaphysical commitments or even think to do that. Instead, they begin to imagine what they may be like in the future, what they could be like. But you see, very problematically, the foundation for that future possibility is grounded in what you think they're like, as opposed to the commitments you discern right now. And that's what gets you into trouble. That's what gets everyone into trouble. And it's very difficult to do. But of course, if indeed I am suggesting that one needs to discern, and this doesn't just apply to romantic relationships, but also friendships. You know, we're talking about the need for that environment. Well, the same thing. What are the metaphysical commitments of your friends? You know, what are their higher values, their ultimate concerns, as Paul Tillich says? And discerning that is what is a big, big, big deal. But of course, if it is the case that the majority don't engage in deep thought, then actually that would mean the majority doesn't actually own their metaphysical commitments and maybe don't even have any. So then it actually becomes very difficult to have relationships. Relationships become hard, in all honesty. You know, they become difficult. They don't have to be difficult, but they become much more, how they unfold is all over the place. They're much more different because they're not bound. And maybe, you know, people say, but that's good because it's creative possibility. Usually it's not. Usually it's not, because because if you married them or got in a relationship or made friends with them because they were X range of possibility at the time, and they go off into Z range, well, that's not what you got in a friendship or discern. So kind of infinite creative, we actually want our relationships, the people we're relating to be bound, not like restricted, but kind of bound by something. But the thing is, what do we try to bind them with? We try to bind them with our expectations, which doesn't work and actually just sets us up. You want to discern how people are choosing to bind themselves and relate to that. And that tends to be their metaphysical commitments. That tends to be the things that their ultimate concerns. And is that what you want in your life? Do you want a person in your life that chooses to bind themselves to and by that set of metaphysical commitments, that set of values, that sense of things? And if so, boom, relate to that person as a friend, spouse, so on and so forth. But do not relate to people on grounds of expectation. Do not relate to them on that, because because then it's almost necessarily a kind of, I don't want to say violent relationship, but it's a relationship of force, because you're trying to bind them by your expectation. It's kind of forceful, it's kind of violent. So of course there's going to be conflict. You're literally trying to stuff them. And yet at the same time, we can't like relate to people who we don't know what they're going to be like at all, right? But so the issue is simply, what is the source of the binding per se, and what it should be is people's own metaphysical commitments.
I think it's quite questionable about whether we truly ever know someone, because
human
beings
absolutely.
are constantly evolving.
That's right.
Do we ever really know someone? So when it comes to friendships or relationships, we have an expectation, and yes, we're aware of change. One must acknowledge that people evolve and they'll grow up, grow old. There will be change. But we forget to recognize the way we change in the process too, because we're changing for that person as much as they're changing for us. But we are so caught up in doing right by our expectation that we fail to acknowledge, are we meeting the other person's expectation? You know, if we often tend to empathize with people, but we don't really empathize with ourselves. You know, it's constantly us putting ourselves in other people's shoes, but sometimes you've just got to be in your own shoes and see where you stand. You know, because empathizing is really easy, because you're never really going through what the other person's going through. Like, you'll never know. You can imagine, you can try and understand. So it's really important to realize that change is a two-way street.
Yes.
Just because you think you haven't changed does not mean the other person does not see that or doesn't believe that. And what has changed? Perhaps this person hasn't changed drastically, but it's just that your expectation wasn't met. And now you're like, you know, this person hasn't changed, or this person isn't who he was yesterday, you know, or she was yesterday. They're not as involved, they're not as engaging. It could be many things. It could be time, it could be work, it could be the circumstances we live in. Sometimes you don't disconnect because someone's a problem. You disconnect to reconnect with yourself. You disconnect to reevaluate your values. You disconnect to reflect on yourself. You try and realize and come into terms with who you are today as to who you were when you first began that journey. But we often tend to forget that in friendships and relationships, in work environments. All of these relationships often tend to be just mine, it's all about I. It's never about us. We talk about an us, but do we really become an us? We don't. Most of the times we don't. And if you don't, you have a failed relationship, right? And that's inevitable, because there's two factors. And if you just see yourself as a common denominator, it's not true. The common denominator is your expectations of each other. How you meet it is entirely up to you. Do you meet halfway? Do you compromise your expectation? And that's where expression, communication, and projection of thoughts sort of come into play, because when you communicate, you're talking to the person, but when you're expressing, you're talking at the person, because you somehow expect them to realize that this is what's written in stone and you ought to be this person. There's no other way. This is not going to work if you don't become X, Y, and Z. Another thing that we really need to consider in friendships, in families, I mean, we don't really choose our family. I mean, we don't choose where we're born, who we're born to, which country, all of that. But we do have a say in the relationships we forge moving forward. What we need to realize is that we are friends, not because I want to be your friend, but because you also want to be my friend. That one comes first. Then the fact that I reciprocate that feeling comes into play, and you know, it's the cherry on top of the cake that, wow, you feel the same way. But we often forget that the first reason why this person responded because they were intrigued, or because they felt the need or want to do so. And that often gets lost in translation or communication of emotions and thoughts, because you forget to consider the other person's expectation because you're so blinded by yours. And it doesn't create a sense of accountability, because we don't really hold ourselves accountable most of the times. It's easy to hold other people accountable, hence why we keep, you know, blame shifting. You know, we keep saying, oh, it's you, it's never me. But that's because I never held myself accountable. But I'm holding you accountable for your actions, for the consequences I created, which is unfair, which is completely unfair. And that's where you sort of lose your rationality in thought.
Well, it's funny because responsibility, you know, relationships become things that our friends are responsible for, not us. You know, relationships become what other people are responsible for, not us. And are they maintaining the relationship? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? And again, as we were saying, we have to choose our hermeneutical framework or interpretation of, you know, to what degree we're responsible, what degree we're reacting. And I said, you know, always think in terms of you could do better, because that's the good hedge, right? Either way, you can do better next time. So similarly, it's always best to think of your responsibility as opposed to their responsibility, because your responsibility is going to make you think about how can I do better, not thinking about how they're doing worse, because we don't tend to think about how other people are doing in the relationship when they're doing well. Nobody talks about the health of a relationship when it's going great. It used to be when it's bad. So almost by definition, when we're thinking about relationships, they almost are bad. And if we're not, but you know, and you tend to be thinking about how they're not doing what they need to be doing. But instead, if you flip it and say, well, I'm responsible for the relationship, how can I be somebody that people want to have a relationship with? How can I be a better person for them, right? Well, that totally changes your framework, because now, although in the other schema, you almost by definition have to be negative, it is now possible when you turn it on yourself for it to be positive, to be thinking about the health of relationships in terms of them being good and making them better and excellent, not they're bad and something's wrong. It's an entirely different mindset. I mean, also too, if you do that, you start asking questions about, I want to spend time with these people. Well, am I interesting to be around? Do I make their time more valuable when they're around me? Do I add something to their lives? You don't think about, instead of going, they don't want to spend time, they're not spending enough time with me. You start asking instead, well, I must not be attracting them to me to spend time with me. You start thinking about what you could do better. You put the onus on you. And I think that's also what a friend should do, right? I mean, a friend shouldn't be putting the responsibility on their friends. A spouse shouldn't be putting on their spouse. You know, if you love, in some respects, the idea of loving someone is precisely to put the onus on you, you know, right? To be kind of looking at yourself as opposed to on them. So I think that's one thing that's helpful, is to kind of have that framework. How do I make myself more interesting, more loving, you know, someone that people want to be around, as opposed to why aren't they spending more time with me? If they were a real friend, they would. It's all negative when you turn it out as opposed to in. When you turn it in, it can be positive. The other thing too is like words like expectation, you know, a few things, these words all get kind of conflated, which I think contribute to the confusion. Like, for example, it is good to assume that in your marriage, your husband's not going to throw things at you. You know, that's a fair expectation, right? But in a sense, though, that's given. It's like it's supposed to be given. It's just like a very base groundwork where you just assume that your husband is not going to every day throw something at you, right? That's a fair expectation. But you see, this kind of expectation seems kind of different than the expectation that if they love you, they'll get you, you know, bring you flowers on Friday or something, right? You know, because it seems like there's a difference between like a givenness, like you know, it's just kind of given. It's just kind of the rules of the game that we don't throw stuff at one another because we're married, and the expectation of you will do certain things. Because and it seems like we conflate those. We say, well, it's good to have expectations because they shouldn't throw mugs at you. Therefore, they should buy you dinner on Friday. Wait, hold on. There was a jump there somewhere we have to be careful about. And you see, that's what gets us in trouble, is because it's okay to kind of assume there are rules. We conflate rules with expectations and then justify having these expectations where we try to put people in boxes because we think they're the same thing, but they're not the same thing. And you see, and once we begin having, because the other thing too is expectations, usually the drama of expectations are a result of particularizing a generality in terms that we want. And what I mean by that is when we say, okay, I expect them to love me because they married me, therefore that's part of the rules. Well, since it's okay, since I expect them to love me, I expect them to take walks with me in the afternoon, because if they love me, they take walks with me in the afternoon. Well, wait a minute. Did you ever tell them you wanted to take walks in the afternoon? Well, I shouldn't have to, because they said they loved me, right? So they should know that we should take walks in the afternoon. That's where you get in trouble, you take a general principle, a general given, a general rule, and begin assuming the particular manifestations of what that looks like relative to what you want to do. So the movement of an expectation or a rule, as I'm so describing, from the general to the particular, in assuming that the particular is as self-evident and obvious and given as the generality, is what gets you in infinite trouble. It gets people in infinite trouble all the time. Because love and things like that are then relative to the love language, and so on. You say, well, this is what I love, so therefore. So that's what gets you into trouble, because really, if we want to talk about valid expectations that are meaningfully definable from rules, it must be based on like words. Like if I say to you, I'm going to be at the train station at 2 o'clock, you are justified to expect me to be at the train station at 2 o'clock, because that's what we said. That's what we clearly verbalized, right? And so it's actually good. And if the person isn't there at 2, you are justified to say, you didn't meet my expectations, because you agreed to it. The terms were agreed. The only valid expectation, there's he is, come right back. The only valid expectations are ones that are based on very clear words, like spoken and said. But here's the funny thing.
I'm so glad you've gotten into this.
Yeah, because like if you say it, well, then it's granted. And because the expectation is based on a material reality, like something there. But here's the funny thing. We actually think that if they love me, I shouldn't have to tell them. So then we the only valid expectations are ones based on language, like exchanges of sentences. And yet this romantic impulse makes it in us where they should just know without language. So we want expectations that don't have the foundation that make expectations valid. Like unspoken expectations is by definition a kind of contradiction if we have meaningfully defined it from rules, which are just the givens that in a marriage you don't throw cups at one another. I was saying, for example, like people conflate those. So, but then if that's the case, then the skill of communication is quite critical, isn't it? Like we were saying earlier, and also to be in a group of people who can also communicate and understand correctly. Communication then becomes like really paramount if you're going to have valid expectations. And expectations in terms of like I just described, meeting you at the train station at 2, well, those are just necessary to get by. You have to have like, we agree we're going to be at the train station at 2 because otherwise we won't catch the train. Those kind of expectations are just how you get through your day and become necessary, but they must be based on language and what is actually said. If they're based on this kind of romantic ideal of never saying, hard to get, well, that's what people do, and it just causes endless disaster and different things like that.
Yeah. Michelle, what do you think?
Well, I think that's I'm so glad you guys got to this area of it. I mean, it kind of makes me think that then there's kind of a difference then if you just have a want and you communicate it, then it's not really an expectation, right? It's just I have a want and I'm going to give that to the person as this is something I want.
Yes.
And then it's, fulfilled, or the person says, I can't do that today. Can we do it tomorrow or something like that?
Yes.
And
there's nothing wrong with having wants.
Yeah.
It's this game of saying I have wants and I'm not going to voice them and just expect you to know them.
Well, I do wonder, because I think a lot about it, in terms of growing up in the family dynamic and, people who you spend day in and day out with, you sort of get to know them. You get to know the things they like or don't like, you get to, sure. And, I think, too, if you have sort of that dynamic of a family working together, then I think a lot about my sisters and my mom and how we kind of do things together, very, very much like just sort of sharing the tasks together. And I wonder if it's like, I don't know, I guess maybe the thought is like, well, with enough time and maybe the foundation of those words, is there ever a time you kind of, I don't know, evolve, or maybe it's not evolve, because it is always, I think the best way is to stick with language in the sense of you can't then start to be mad at the person or disappointed or frustrated if you haven't ever communicated.
Well, once you have rules, once they've been established, then people can just know them and they can just operate. It's where the problem is we come from families, all of us, that tend to have that, basically
you've got
years
decades where you've already,
and then you get in a marriage and it seemed like it just happened magically in the family, and then you get in a marriage and it's like, oh wait, you actually have to establish it, and so therefore you think you're doing something wrong because you came into a world where it was just there, and it actually turns out that your parents actually built it or did so. Maybe they didn't and it's not good, but they did it and you just didn't see, so you got the impression that it just happened when you're in the right environment. And so then there can be some discombobulation. But even like families that have a flow to them, if they don't practice good communication, and just will have lots of drama, for these reasons.
That's true. I mean, I think that having the verbal basis of exchanges is very important. I mean, I think a lot of times if you think about like mainstream, dating and concepts of romance, there is a lot of the idea of like, well, he should just know, or she should just know. Why would she do this when she knows I don't like her to do that or whatever? And it's like, well, first of all, did you ever say anything? Second of all, is that even valid? Is that something that you're kind of beholding the person to, that maybe you shouldn't in the first place? But if it's something that isn't like harmful, like, oh, I like to get tea with you on Sundays or something like that, then as long as you communicate that and have are reasonable, I think too. Well, if the person has some event with their friends or
they work it,
it's like, well, okay, that's perfectly fine. Having that sense of open-handedness to say, it's okay if it doesn't work out, or if it does work out, but really, I think the ability to share once or share communication is an important. I mean, I know that it's obviously, but it is very important. I think the place of once, like I think about children, like our children, and how they just, children just, I want this, mommy, I want that, I want that, daddy, like I would, can I get the unicorn cup? And they might have particular ones even, but they're just sort of like very not shy to just say what they want. And I think maybe the fear with expressing once is the concern that it will not be met, or it will not be understood, or maybe that it will be seen as an expectation.
Well, I mean, you got a lot of you've got people who've assumed once are bad. You've got people who assume once are always good. You've got people that assume once are true self, false self. You got all these that can only be sorted by thinking about the particularities of the situation, but you have a society that hasn't trained thinking. So then you have trouble. I mean, one of the problems that can be with this kind of idea that they should just know is it can feed into this kind of thinking that things are they just are the way they're supposed to be, if they're right. Like if it's the right person, that things are they just are that way. Well, that takes the impetus out of working, and that feeds back to not training your thinking, because your thinking just are. They necessarily present themselves as right. Nobody thinks a thought that they think is right. Like if it's an opinion piece, you wouldn't think it if it was wrong. So if you're just trained to think that things are right when they feel like they just are right, well, then every thought that comes into your head that feels right, you just assume is right. You never train the skills of deep thinking, and then you become a crazy overthinker when you run into problems later on. So these things kind of train you. But if you train yourself to have disciplined thinking, well, then actually it starts coming naturally, right? In the same way that if you get that foundation in the relationship, or if you've got people who are committed to one another, the good, the beautiful, and the true, and they're able to communicate, well, then it starts to become a dance. It does start to have an organic emergent principle that just sort of happens.
I think that is such a good point of how you have that. You really actually do have that foundation over many years with the people you've like done life with for many years. And you don't have that immediately with your spouse.
And you've been trained by society to think that is evidence that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
That it was a bad choice. Yeah.
And I think there are some things where it's like, well, wouldn't he or she just know? Like I think there is something where it's like, well, obviously they would, but the thing is, you always have to think about that. How could that be used against yourself? And how would you feel about that being used against you? And so then don't do that to the other person.
Right.
Sure. It's kind of like, there are certain things that maybe seem very obvious to you, but to the other person, it's not so obvious. And it doesn't mean they don't care, or they don't love you, or they don't want to help if they don't see it and you need to ask them. It's simply the fact that maybe they just needed to have that be alerted to their attention or something like that.
Well, I mean, the other thing that gets people in trouble in relationships or friends or whatever is assuming bad reason. Mm-hmm. Like generally people do what they do for good reason, or what they think is good, not that it's actually good. So another key to all this is assuming that the people around you are doing what they're doing for good reason, that they have a reason for what they're doing. And if they're not doing the thing that you think if they're not doing the thing that you think they should be doing, then there's probably a reason they think is good for why they are not doing it. So you should investigate, as opposed to judge. People tend to judge as opposed to investigate. You were talking about the pause earlier, how so much of it is the pause. Investigating we said that the question is a pause put into words. Likewise, an investigation is a similar thing. So instead of like judging the people, investigate their motives, investigate their reasons. Oh, it turned out they didn't cut the grass when you expected them to do it because they read the weather and it's going to rain tomorrow. Or it's going to rain wet. There's a reason why they're not doing the thing you thought they were going to do or should do or clean to do. We can make a million examples. But you're just trained by this kind of zeitgeist of romance to assume that you should judge them. because people are stupid, you know, or people are bad. And
or
so
they
then,
should be one with me, so they should have my thoughts. They should know my
and so then
thoughts.
people have infinite drama, just infinite drama.
I think the main reason why we have infinite drama is because we usually tend to hear what we expect.
Yes.
We only want to hear what we expect. It's, yes, we talk about commitment and we acknowledge the other person, but we only acknowledge them as far as they meet our expectations.
Yes.
The moment you don't, you question, you know, their integrity or their credibility or how they are willing to compromise. All of a sudden you're like, this person isn't meeting my expectation. Oh, they've changed, and they've changed negatively, not positively.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's perhaps because you have communicated your expectation, but it's not aligned with where that individual is right now. And you have to consider that the journey might have togetherness, but it's also an individual journey of our very own. It's two people that come together. They're still two individuals.
Right.
And, you know, this question of oneness and sameness comes into play there. Like, you know, yes, you've chosen to share one life, but there are two individual souls there. There are two minds there. They never become one. Yes, perspectives come together, but perspectives, there are times when perspectives don't come together, and you have to be okay with that happening. You have to be okay with knowing that we will agree to disagree, or there are times when I will just walk away to clear my thoughts and come back and talk to you because I need to process what you just said because I never thought about it. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly.
And it's very interesting, Michelle, that you mentioned about, you know, children expressing their wants so freely. Sometimes I wonder, is it because we are constantly around them at a young age, because we're just always present, physically present around them, that they think no matter what, this person's always going to be there, so I'm just going to express my wants and needs, you know, like freely. I mean, you know, as naive and gullible that impression is, or that way of thinking is, as a child, I think that's what they really rely on. You know, it's never biological for a child.
Right.
Whoever holds them first is their mother. They never really know, right? You can't really say, I mean, yes, we talk about genes and DNA and all of that, but it's really a thought. We are bound by the thought of this is mine and I am his or I am hers. You know, you're bound by the thought that this is my child, this is my flesh and blood. And then you ingrain that thought into your children, and then they sort of grasp and understand, yes, you know, this is my mother or my father and we are biologically entwined. But that's about it, isn't it? Because you could really let a newborn be held by anyone and they would instantly think, oh, you know, this is who my mother is, or this is what maternal warmth is or feeling is. You don't really know the individual for the biology of it. It's really the thought, right? So that dependency occurs by the way we present ourselves, whether it's emotionally or physically or in terms of our thoughts. That dependency occurs where you think, oh, this person will be there no matter what I do, no matter what I say, because you've created that sense of comfort for them. It's different. Obviously, it's different when it comes to raising children, but when it's relationships, it tends to happen. You know, it really tends to happen where this person becomes so comfortable with perhaps manipulating you or taking you for granted or misunderstanding you because you've always been there. You're okay walking on eggshells because, you know, you don't want to lose the individual or the potential you see in them. So you encourage them to think that you can be taken for granted. We often play victim, but I feel like we dig our own graves in the end of the day when it comes to the way people treat us. Because if we don't set high standards for ourselves, it's very unlikely that another individual will, because human beings are selfish creatures. We only think for ourselves. And that's the reality of it, you know, as morbid as it sounds, we tend to always think very highly of ourselves. It's always about us. How does it serve us? How does it affect us? So when it comes to the way someone portrays you or treats you, I think we really manipulate an individual's thought, whether it's positive or negative. It's the impression we make. It's our tone. It's our expression of those thoughts that sort of tell them, oh, I could probably walk all over this person and we'd be absolutely fine. They'd be completely fine if I throw a mug at them, you know, that's okay, because you've made them feel it's okay.
Right.
So who's at fault? We never take, I mean, Daniel, you talked a little bit about reflecting and about it being inwards. We usually tend to do that when we blame ourselves. We always think, why me? Why does it always keep happening to me? Why is it always me? I'm probably the problem. We never do that when it comes to praising ourselves, you know, and that's quite ironic, because as selfish as what a human being can be, we're never kind to ourselves. We never think gently for ourselves. We always think about doing better. But sometimes we forget to acknowledge the good, to go to the better, you know, we just don't acknowledge the present good. We don't acknowledge the goodness in now. We just talk about that heightened foresight, you know, where you think ahead and you're like, yes, there could be greatness, but there's good, better, great, not from good to greatness or from mediocrity to greatness. The journey of now is often neglected in our mind as much as we think to survive. We want to survive at our optimum. We don't acknowledge our lesser days, for instance. There are days when you don't feel yourself and you're not as, you know, stimulating or thought-provoking, or you're not thinking sense at all, but you don't want to embrace that. You don't want to embrace your lesser days. You know, much like the moon, we go through phases, you know, we don't just become fuller in a day. It's a process. But in our mind, it isn't. It's always the optimum. We always want the high of the ultimatum or the absolute or the finish of something. And I feel like that's where a lot of things in our minds sort of make us question our very existence, because fate is end game for us, right? We don't believe that fate keeps changing. Every day defines a new fate for us. Today could lead to a whole different outcome. It could change our perspective forever. This conversation, you know, we'll be walking out of this conversation completely different, and that could be the fate of this conversation. But that doesn't mean it's over. You're going to wake up tomorrow, perhaps have a conversation with another thinker, and you're stimulated further and you evolve. I think that's where we sort of have to reevaluate our thoughts. Why does fate have to be absolute? Why does it have to be the end game? Like, why is fate the end? Why can't it just be an evolving progression of thoughts that happen, that get better, that go back and forth? It's like a boomerang. You go back and forth with your thoughts, and that's fine. You don't have to hit the peak. You can hit the peak of a realization, and then comes another one, much like age, you know. You go around the earth for 365 days, 366, and there you go. You're a year older, a year wiser. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But you've got to believe that every day is a new fate. You decide your fate. I mean, it's much like karma. That's a whole different topic. But I just feel like even karmic energy is what we do every day. It's what we collect, what we manifest. Our intentions every day change our karma. So why should you think fate is absolute when your very existence isn't, right? Because this isn't permanent. We're not going to be here forever. Our physicality is changing every day. It's changing by the minute. We're the youngest we can ever be and the oldest we'll ever be, until the next moment, until tomorrow. So why can't fate be the same?
Yeah. Okay, I'll just say something really quick here. I think it's it makes me think of on the onset about how I think I said something explicitly about how, well, it seems that no matter what you think today, whatever is meant to be, right, is still out there kind of waiting for you to encounter. So it's strange because it feels like fate is in a way it's certain, like absolute in that, to use your language, Sanduni, but in a way it's not, because you have yet to encounter it, right? And who's to say how you will encounter it, you know? So in a way, it's like it is fixed and it's not at the same time. It's fixed and it's also fictitious in that you will encounter it with your perspective. Like we said, that's so important to the fate of thought. And therefore, I think there's something about it you're right. There's something that changes about it, but also it's almost like from a different perspective, from maybe a higher perspective or vantage point. It's maybe it is a certain location or it has a certain, you know, phenotype, but for you yourself, it's actually very uncertain, and you don't know, and you really won't know until you're there. So I'll say that.
Well, I mean, if yeah, I understand. So again, can you believe it? Well, if we're, we were saying that thought and freedom are tied together. Well, then the fate of thought is the fate of freedom. And so, what is the fate of freedom? What are you going to do? Oh, take your time. what are you going to do with your freedom? You are fated to have freedom. You are determined to be free. You are fated to be free. What is the fate you create with your freedom? And that's how you get this kind of blur between, freedom and causation and different things. A few things I meant, like also too, when we're talking about like an expectation, you said you're going to be at the train station at 2 and you agree, and that's a valid expectation. Well, there's also there's also the extra layer of, is the expectation itself good? Is it actually good to go to the train station at 3 because they're closed on Sunday at 3 o'clock, right? So you also have this question of determining the good. Like, is the expectation a good expectation? Is it an expectation we should even verbally talk about? And you can say that about wants too, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with wants if they're good, if they are toward a good end. Well, that layer right there is where so much of the conflict can happen, because people can disagree on what's a good want and what's a good expectation. This is why the genuine commitment to what is good, as best as we can determine, regardless if it aligns with what I think is good or what you think is good, it's good, so we're going to conform to that, whatever it is so critical, because then there's the possibility of a shared groundwork on which expectations should even be discussed, which wants should even be exercised. But if you don't have a shared commitment to the actual good versus simply your idea of the good, well, then you don't even have a shared basis for like determining what you should do, and then you get a lot of trouble. The other thing that I think, like you were mentioning how you go into a relationship and you blame yourself, or you go inward in a bad way. You see, this is where it gets into the interesting framing that you described between reacting and responding. We tend to react to relationships in a negative way, where we turn negatively, but if we respond to them and ask, well, how can I be more interesting? How can I be someone who people want to be around? We're not just reacting to what was said. We're thinking more broader. We're actually responding to the reality that we will be in relationships, not reacting to the relationships we are in. When we react to the relationships we're in, it tends to be negative, exactly what you say. But when we respond to the truth that we're going to be in relationships, then we tend to, in our quiet time, think about, how can I do things in my quiet time or when I'm alone, so that when I'm relating, I'm helping people, or I'm someone that those people want to relate to. So what's kind of funny is, to the initial questions on how do you tell if you're responding into reacting, one of the good rules of thumb is that you're probably responding to relationships when you're cultivating how you're going to be in relationships outside of relationships. And you're probably reacting to relationships when you're cultivating how you're going to be to relationships in relationships. You're probably responding to how you are as an individual when you are cultivating it's the opposite here, because when you're finding yourself within relationships, that's when you're actually responding to the fact that you're going to be alone, responding to the fact that at the end of the day, you're stuck with yourself. Whereas if you're just looking in the mirror one night after you get back from dinner, you're just reacting to the fact that you're alone, because now you're just sad, right? So it's interesting that by actually kind of matching up opposites into opposite situations, those are usually when you can tell if you're reacting or if you're, responding. For example, if you're in a creative writing classroom and the teacher is telling you need to write a story, well, then you're probably just, and you write a story, then maybe you can't really tell if you're responding to something in you that wants to write stories, or if you're just reacting to the instruction of the teacher. It becomes hard to tell. But if you're alone at home and no one's telling you should write stories, in fact, people are telling you that writing stories is a waste of time, that you shouldn't do it. Well, if in that environment, you're probably responding to something inside of you, because all of the external pressures are against you. So usually when there's a kind of mismatch, in a sense, between the external and the internal, sort of the aim and the environment, that's when you can start to tell more clearly the difference between, reaction and response, where you can get a better gauge. Now, it doesn't necessarily follow that being in a creative writing classroom means you're just reacting to creative writing, because maybe you're there because you responded to an inner drive when you were at home, and that's why you put yourself in the classroom. But if the question is how do you test, it's basically kind of well, how do you test yourself? How do you know your motives? Well, by maybe withdrawing from that environment when you don't have the support of everyone telling you that writing is great. What do you do then? Do you write stories when no one praises you for it? What do you do then? Do you go inward and think about who you are as a person when you're not reacting to people? Do you do that on your own? Or do you only do it when people say something that makes you turn inward? Because then your introspection may just be reactionary and not responsive. So, kind of examining that phenomenology, I think, can kind of help get a good test on yourself, a good reading on yourself.
I think it's quite ironic because thought is indifferent to authority. Thought is certain. It comes when it comes and it goes when it goes. It is what it is. However, when we talk about writing, for example, humans are innate storytellers, Daniel, whether you like it or not. We always have a story, we have narrative, and we express undoubtedly, confidently. Somehow it comes out. If there's a story, it'll be said, whether it's heard or not. But we do live in a society where storytelling or praise comes in terms of likes, in terms of shares, in terms of how many times it's been retweeted, how many times someone sent you a very long message praising your work or asked to collaborate with you. But what I told Michelle during our first conversation was, you are your biggest audience because you read it first.
Right. And
when you think to write, you think to express, whether verbally, written, however the form of expression. So your goal to express has been met. Yes. Regardless of how accepted by the outer world. You as a writer became a writer because you wrote. How profound or how mediocre or how original the work is, that's completely up to interpretation.
Right.
I mean, we are thinkers. We're here challenging philosophers every single day. So who are we to not be open to criticism? That's part and parcel. If we are doing it, we should be happy to receive it as well. But that should not determine how we tell our story or in what way we tell our story.
Right.
Yes, influence comes in different ways. When you talk to friends who tell you, you sound profound, you sound very spectacular and confident, I think you should do a talk show, or your work is great, I think it should be out on a platform that's reachable for people, all over the world. That extra push is great. It's important. Sometimes you need to be told what you already know. That's why we're human, and that validation is needed. But it should never be the binding factor of your motives. Right. That's what it usually seems to be, right? Validation is what keeps us going. Oh, yeah. What keeps us going is us validating ourselves.
Right. That's right.
We just think that in the end of the day, you could be friends with 120 people to 120,000 people on social media platforms. But when you're alone with your thoughts, it's just you, physically, mentally, and socially. You are accountable to the way you feel. If you have a bad thought, you'll be sleepless at night, but it's just you, not the 120,000 followers you have on your social media. It's just you on your lesser days. And that's something we have to remember amidst all the fame and the criticism that comes our way, that in the end of the day, I have to live with my work. I have to live with my expression. And that little thought in our head goes way far in how we sort of roll out professionally, emotionally, whether it's our personal life or even in families. Yes, it creates a sense of accountability and it's nice to be seen and heard. But do you see yourself? Do you hear yourself? We never ask ourselves these questions. We think a lot of different things. We have different viewpoints, but we don't really sit down and think, how far have I come? How far do I have to go? How profoundly has my thinking changed from a month ago? Right. How much effect has writing this piece affected my thought process? Has it changed me? What kind of impact has the research I did to present this piece had on me? We don't ask those questions. We never sort of have that. We don't give ourselves that freedom of just being freely ourselves. One must acknowledge themselves, we agree to disagree, we have all of that, but we never really have a conversation with ourselves unless it's stimulated or provoked or triggered by an external factor.
Well, I think everything you're getting at gets at the reality that basically the most important thing is to figure out in your life how to cultivate intrinsic motivation, and to figure out the thing that you are intrinsically motivated to do and do that. In the same way that what you're describing is also provides frames, outlines a very critical rule of thumb, which is because we're asking these questions of how do we determine when we're reacting, responding, what is our test or heuristic, and so on and so forth. Basically, the more unconditional the thing, the higher the likelihood that it's real. The more unconditional the thing, the more the higher likelihood it's real. And what I mean by that is the less conditions you need to write, the less conditions that have to be met for you to write, the higher the likelihood that you are intrinsically motivated to write, because you didn't need the classroom, you didn't need the prayer, you didn't need these different things. Maybe you needed 10x conditions to go run, to exercise, but you only needed 3 conditions to write. Well, we would say that writing is more intrinsically motivated than running. But maybe to do yoga, you need 0 conditions. You just do it. Well, then you are completely intrinsically motivated to do yoga, because there were no conditions you needed. You would just do it under it. That means if there's no condition, that means under any condition that you would do it. So following that heuristic, we're asking questions about relationships. You know, the thing Michelle and I always talk about is the greatest test for determining the health of a relationship is, what do you do when you're alone in a room together? How does it go? Are you bored? Are you looking at your phones? You know, are you not interested in one another, or are you interested in one another? Like when there are no conditions, when there's no fun, you know, there's no beach, there's no movie theater, like there's none of those conditions. It's just all the way down to like it's almost like it's like an environment where it's like a scientific experiment where it's just the people, it's just the variable. You can get a real clear reading on the health of the relationship in that environment. And what happens, you know, and if you're in that room together, because you know, someone always talk about, like, you can't always be at the movie theater, you can't always be on a trip, you're going to be in the kitchen, you're going to be cleaning things. So really, I mean, a lot of, you know, people talk about communication as important for relationships, but they don't say conversation is important for relationship. Conversation is what's critical. Communication, the problem with that language is just like, it's important that when you have a fight, you can talk about it. That's basically what it sounds like. Communicate. Be sure you communicate. And I know, and that's true. But communicate is kind of, in this sense, a negative value. Let's talk about the positive value of conversation. A relationship needs conversation, which of course will entail the ability to communicate if there's disagreement, but it's not just the ability to communicate when there's disagreement. Conversation, well, I mean, think about it. Who are the friends you're closest with? I mean, the people you feel like you can speak friendly with, you know, freely with. I understand, you know, there's shoulder to shoulder, face to face, and so on and so forth. But even guys who claim they're shoulder to shoulder and like dirt biking together, they get off the dirt bikes and they talk about the dirt bike. They enjoy talking about the dirt bike. This whole, like, there are some people that just like to be silent and shoulder to shoulder. I don't see it. I think that's kind of silly. But conversation is quite critical, which I think is more positive than communication, because here's the thing. Conversation is something you can do regardless the conditionality. It can be on a boat. It can be in a room. It can be with money. It cannot be with money. You can converse regardless. So it's more non-conditional, right? And so if the name of the game is intrinsic motivation, and what things are like when it's non-conditional, when there's no conditions, you know, the less conditions, well, then conversing, intrinsic motivation are really, really critical. And they become very good heuristics to determine what friendships are the ones you should focus on, what relationships are the ones you should focus on, you know, and the things that you will do regardless the conditionality, rather there's praise, rather there's a class or whatever, those are the things you should focus on. So you start just going through your life and thinking about it in terms of intrinsic motivation and focusing on those things, because those are also the things that you find the most joy in. Well, because almost by definition, right? You know, the reason you're doing it is because of the joy. Yeah. So intrinsic motivation is really critical. And arguably, one of the reasons the world seems to be in so much trouble is because there's so much external motivation and there's not enough internal motivation. People are getting, you know, they are in the relationship to get something, not for the relationship itself. They're in, you know, they're going to the college to get somewhere, not for the sake of learning itself, you know, and so on and so on and so on. The name of the game is intrinsic motivation and lifestyles free of the tyranny of conditionality.
Absolutely. I think education plays a profound role in that as well.
Yes.
Like, are you learning? Are you studying? Are you thinking? Or are you being brainwashed? You know, all of these come into play.
Well, not to interrupt, because if you can't do those things, you can't discern intrinsic motivation. Like, you have to be able to do those things.
Yes, absolutely. And I think different education systems sort of plant different motivations in your mind, you know, whether it comes to Ivy League, you know, universities or colleges. You are sort of, if you go into it, I don't quite know what the system is like over there, Daniel, but here there's this whole public versus private thing, colleges, and the whole dynamic there. I think it's everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's part and parcel of your expectations from education. Are you doing it because you need that piece of paper that validates your worth in the corporate world or the academic world? Or do you want that piece of paper because that comes with a certain sense of wisdom? Right. Then again, you know, that's also debatable. Is it just accumulated book knowledge, or are you actually wise? Have you understood what you've learned?
But, you know, that's the whole trick, that you almost have to be wise to know what wisdom is, right? That's like the whole trick. Like, if you don't know something, you don't even know you don't know it. But again, one of the reasons why intrinsic motivation is so critical is because if there's all these things that you don't even know you don't know, well, then you don't know where to stop. So it'd just be best not to stop, whatever the thing is, to keep having intrinsic motivation. So you'll just keep going. You know, if there's something you don't know, well, good thing you're not extrinsically motivated, because you'd probably stop before you got to that thing. So intrinsic motivation kind of takes care of this problem of true ignorance, of not knowing that you don't know different higher levels of goodness, truth, and beauty, or friendship, or different things, because you're just going to keep doing the thing, where it's almost as if when you're living according to extrinsic motivation, you're almost kind of set up for failure in a way, because you're going to stop whenever you get to the thing that you're externally motivated for. And there's probably infinite horizons beyond that, but you're going to stop because the whole reason you did the thing was to get to here. You've gotten here, you stopped. But if you're intrinsically motivated, here's the go, you just keep going and you go off to those infinite horizons. And so the intrinsic motivation is critical, and unfortunately education doesn't seem to incubate that. Hopefully that can change. I think it could, but intrinsic motivation becomes critical. And then, of course, relationships, you know, if you determine what you are intrinsically motivated to do, if you love philosophy or philosophical discussion or writing and so on, well, then a heuristic to determine friendships are people who help incubate you in that intrinsic motivation, and of whom you help incubate their intrinsic motivation, you know, that you help them get better in that thing. And so then everyone's, you know, you're taking care of everyone, and and also you're helping free them from conditionality as they're helping you be free from conditionality. And that becomes, does the relationship do that or not? If it doesn't do that, you may not want to focus on it. If it does do that, you should pour into it. And so I think you start getting kind of a test by which to determine, you know, which relationships to focus on, which to enter into, and so on and so forth. And that heuristic also, if you follow it, gives you very strong reason to think that you are responding to life, not just reacting to it. Life will, if you're only reacting to life, then you're extrinsically motivated, because life only gives you extrinsic motivations. It gives you things to want, food, shelter, so on and so forth. But if you're intrinsically motivated, well, then you are responding to life. You are acting in it in a manner that is changing it into something more than what it simply is, and tries to extrinsically motivate you accordingly. So freedom, so intrinsic motivation and transcending conditionality, moving beyond conditionality, are strong heuristics to understand yourself as responding to life, not just reacting to it. Even though at the end of the day, you can never have certainty, on the grounds of those heuristics, you can certainly be confident.
Absolutely. And I think the motivation comes with a sense of self-awareness, like we said earlier. You've got to sort of be mindful and aware to differentiate between reacting and responding, because ignorance is known to be bliss, but it really isn't when it comes to this, because if you don't know the difference, you're never likely to learn what you don't know, because you don't believe you've got anything left to learn.
That's right.
And that's where you become ignorant. And sometimes, you know, people do argue that it's blissful, because the less less you know, the less you question. But you know, that's completely subjective to the individual. Having said that, that sort of motivation comes through a sense of self-awareness. Now, how do we get there is the question. What inspires you to be more self-aware? Because self is always there, right? We physically exist, but our mental self comes into a confined form of existence that's more refined and in check and disciplined only with that awareness.
Right.
Where you're able to call yourself out on your thoughts. And
Right.
how do you sort of get there? How do you think and think and think, and eventually you have an epiphany, and there you are, you're mindful now, you're enlightened? Or is it a realization? That's another tricky question that I would totally like to indulge in. You know, this whole sense of being enlightened, you know, and being mindful and awake. You know, do you meditate on your thoughts? Do you meditate on your physical environment? Do you come in tune with all that is there, all of your organs, your environment, the weather, your breathing, the pace, the sound, and eventually does it sink? Or is it a realization? Because meditation is a form that you only have to physically do till you come into a meditating state of mind. So how do you get there? Do you think the same thing 100 million times and eventually it makes sense? Or do you just come into terms with the fact that you can think of something so many times and it can still not make sense? Mm-hmm. Because there is an argument that says sometimes life is meant to be lived and not made sense of. You know, you've got to live your emotions, you've got to live your thoughts to see the outcome. You know, it's trial and error. Some things you do not have to entertain, some things you do. And so is there sense to be made in our thoughts? You know, these are some questions that I would sort of leave for us to discuss.
They're lovely questions. You know, first, you know, there's a difference between thinking about the cup and realizing that my thought of that cup will never encapsulate the experience of it, and saying there's no point in thinking about that cup because, you know, ultimately, you know, thoughts are dumb. You know, the first is what I'm saying is I need to think to even reach over and get the cup. But even though thought was necessary to reach the cup, the thought will never equal the cup. And therefore, you're saying that the world is always greater than thought, even though thought plays a necessary role. Where the second you're saying thought is dumb and gets in the way of experience. And the second is very problematic because thought actually is what even allows you to enter into the conditionality by which experience in its fullness can hit you that thought cannot encapsulate. So thought is a necessary precondition, but it is not the ultimate concern, if you will. Ultimate concern would be experience. And so therefore enlightenment, if it's going to be valid, must be something that ultimately understands that thinking is important, but for the sake of what is bigger than thinking, which would be life, to use a general term, that cannot be, life without thinking cannot be meaningful. And yet if life is only meaningful, then it's a premise. So, you know, life can't, and if life is a premise, yeah, it's kind of bad. It's pretty boring, right? So the question is, what I talk about, I guess, in the Reconstructing ASA is the dialectic between perceiving and thinking, you know, between experiencing the laptop and thinking about the laptop, and understanding the thought never captures the laptop, but the thought is necessary to make the laptop meaningful and to work on those two. So enlightenment as a stable state, I think, is problematic because it's like stable, whereas enlightenment as a dialectic of thinking always being informed by experience, and experience always being informed by thinking, and always the two honoring one another. An active enlightenment, I think, is very, very valid. An active enlightenment. And then, of course, the question becomes, how does one achieve this? Well, this, of course, gets into learning how to organize your thinking and how to think in mental models and deep thinking as opposed to overthinking. You cannot have an enlightenment of overthinking, and it has to be deep thinking, which then means it comes to a question of how you relate to the future, how you think about the future, how the present is being formed by the future. Who are the people you are surrounding yourself with? You know, are they people that give you the feedback that makes you better or that pulls you down? You know, you're also simultaneously fighting your frenemy brain that wants to convince you to have a stable, stagnant state. The frenemy brain wants you to believe that the enlightenment is detachment and stability, as opposed to an active thinking that is always going deeper and reconstituting itself in terms of that depth in the context of relationships of other people. Enlightenment doesn't want you to think about that. Enlightenment wants you to go off to the wilderness and be alone, because if you're alone and stable, you might not die in the, you know, so it wants you to have that confusion. So, you know, all of this is like all of these different practices and learning to, instead of think about people in terms of expectations, to think about themselves in commitment, and to think about yourself in terms of commitment. All of these are way of life that organizes yourself toward response, as opposed to have your life just be a result of reactions. And so it becomes this entire plethora of activities to help one become, to be someone who responds to life and therefore is alive, as opposed to reacting to life and being pushed along. And with that, I'm afraid you're trying to say something wonderful. I'm going to say this has been a delightful conversation. You are so delightful. Please say, well, Michelle wants to say something quite quickly after, 3 hours. That was pretty great, wasn't it? But finish. I want to hear Sanduni's point.
Yes, I want to hear too.
Yeah, what is your point? Wonderful, Sanduni.
Thank you. Go on, Michelle. Welcome back. I'm so sorry the kids have been giving you a hard time.
It's all right. It happens sometimes. I thank you for your understanding, my friend.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
I'm so glad that you both took the time to speak to me. I mean, it's quite late there as well, and thank you. And
with 3 kids, it's early, right? No, no, of course, Sanduni. Thank you. So I interrupted you, so I'm so sorry. But thank you, Sanduni. This has been delightful. Thank you for everything.
Was there something, a final note you wanted to end on, Sanduni?
Please.
Yes, we were talking a little bit about enlightenment and sort of being mindful and awake and aware. And I really think if we, for me, enlightenment is about being self-aware, just being aware of the now, because a series of now form the present, also the future. Like we said, the future is the present. We're constantly in formation. This moment was the future 5 minutes ago.
Right.
So it's constantly a formation of what we want the future to be. So perhaps, yes, enlightened is a terminology that's so glamorized, almost making it seem impossible, because for us, it's so difficult to be present in the now. For a bleak moment, we can't just take a step back and stop thinking. When we sit down and have breakfast, we think about lunch or what to have for dinner, something as simple and meaningless as that, even if it's just preparation of the day or our chores.
Yeah.
We never think, I've finished 5 out of the 10 chores that I have to do. You think about the remaining 5. You don't take a moment to just breathe and sort of say, okay, we're done with 5. Now let me have a moment and then power through. It's about living in the now, as difficult as it is. It's really about being accepting of the now, being positively responsive to the now, because now is all we have till the next moment arrives. And yes, our thoughts and our actions make it better or worse for us and our families. However, if you sort of trust in the unfolding of all the nows that occur one after the other, you're just very much trusting the flow. And the only thing that you can't control here is the flow. Much like water, it will take its course. It will go through the highs and lows, the bumps and the nooks and the crooks. It will take its form, its shape, but it will keep flowing. And you've got to go with the flow. And that does not have to be a meditated thought. It could just be a series of now. You unconsciously just doing what you were doing right now is enough sometimes, without a thought. You're here, you're present. And that presence is valid. It doesn't have to be the past moment or the next moment. Present is valid. You being here in this moment, reflecting, absorbing, accumulating, understanding is enough. And that for me is enlightenment. For me, being able to say, I'm here. I'm not there. I'm not there. It's not this. It's not that. It's now. It's all now. It's just this moment. I'm in conversation with 2 people, and that's all I can think about. I'm looking at you 2, and we're talking about the fate of thought, and my only thought is that, not the outcome of this conversation, because the outcome will come, right? It will naturally come. You will get up and talk about this over the kitchen counter or when you go to bed. I will talk about this over lunch. It's inevitable.
Yeah.
But that should not stop me from fully being present and listening to the conversation we're having. And that should just be enough. That's all.
I think that is that's all. And that is perfect. And that is enough. That was beautiful. Well, Sanduni, this has been a delight. Thank you so much for your time. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much time. It was an absolute pleasure, Daniel. We finally spoke.
I
hope I have convinced you to come visit us all here.
I think so.
Yes,
I
please
think
convince
so.
him.
Absolutely. We'll
And
send
I
in-
already have new questions for another talk.
Well,
another
that's
time,
perfect.
so
Hey, 10:30 tomorrow, right?
Yes,
Indeed.
absolutely.
Thank you, Sanduni.
All right.
Thank you so
Have
much.
a lovely
for
rest of
being
the day.